Good morning. Can I welcome members to the second meeting of the Education and Culture Committee in 2013. Can I remind members and those in the public gallery to ensure that electronic devices are switched off at all times, particularly phones obviously. Now the first item of business this morning is consideration of whether to take item 4 in private. Do members wish to take item 4 in private? Agreed? Agreed, thank you. The next item is item 2, is an oral evidence session on broadcasting with BBC Scotland. Now this follows a round-table session that took place last January, and following that, of course, the committee took evidence from Mark Thompson, the former Director General of the BBC, in May. The committee invited George Entwistle, the then Director General, to give further evidence in autumn 2012, and the BBC declined this invitation. Subsequently, the committee took evidence from the NUJ and BEC2 trade unions. Following this session, the committee also then asked the BBC to appear again to discuss the various concerns that were raised by the unions with the committee. The BBC declined that invitation to give oral evidence, but provided the committee with a written evidence discussing the union's submission to the committee. I then wrote, as the committee is aware, to Lord Patton, the Chairman of the BBC Trust, offering the BBC a further opportunity to attend the committee to discuss the substantive issue of programming capacity at major events and other matters. Lord Patton agreed that BBC Scotland senior management would attend the committee. Can I therefore welcome to the committee this morning Ken MacQuarrie, Director, John Boothman, Head of News and Current Affairs, and Bruce Malcolm, Head of Commonwealth Games 2014, all BBC Scotland. Good morning, gentlemen. And can I invite Mr MacQuarrie to make any opening remarks that you may wish to.
Thank you very much, Convener. Before we come to some questions, I thought it might be useful to take stock of what BBC Scotland has achieved in the last few months. Since we appeared here in May, as Convener said, with the Director General, we have reported our most successful ever business year, and that's despite the well-documented challenges we've had from the licence fee settlement and, of course, the various very serious issues surrounding Jimmy Savile. The Deloitte Economic Impact Survey, which some of you may have read last week, revealed that for every £1 of licence fee, the BBC delivers over £2 of value back into the economy, equating in Scotland to around £410 million for the financial year 2011-2012. We now produce 9% of the BBC's network TV spend in Scotland, contributing £80 million of business for the Scottish creative economy. And that's resulted in our network television rising to a record 882 hours, a rise of 52% in just 2 years. And I think last week the First Minister just acknowledged the success of that achievement. That's been achieved through programmes like Mrs Brown's Boys, produced at Pacific Quay, which has become one of the most popular BBC sitcoms in recent times. It's also helped by the move of Waterloo Road to Greenock, which brought a further £20 million of investment. That's over 2 years, as well as 200 jobs. And I'm pleased to say that 90% of these jobs are Scottish-based, and 10% of them within the Greenock area. We also last week, on the 14th, just last week, launched BBC One Scotland HD, and have collected a significant number of industry awards, including Foreign Press Association and a Scottish BAFTA for Mark Daly, one of 7 Scottish BAFTAs who won, 3 UK Grierson Awards, and an international Emmy for our Terry Pratchett documentary. Now, we're aware that the committee was previously concerned about changes to our radio news schedules, but all the indications we have so far are that those changes that have increased the amount of news we offer, have been welcomed by our audiences. And they include changes to our weekend offering, which includes a new 2-hour Good Morning Scotland. Now, I would like to address the issue of the appearance of BBC Scotland before this committee, and particularly at the time it was suggested we were disrespectful to you, and I would just like to say that was not our intention. As you know, we provided detailed evidence to this committee in January and again in May of last year, and in October 2011 to the Scotland Bill Committee on the impact of the licence fee settlement on BBC Scotland. You're aware that the freeze has resulted in a budget reduction of £16 million over the period to 2017, resulting in a required reduction in post numbers of between 100 and 120 from a workforce of around 1,250. A number of those posts have already been closed, 39 last year and another 35 by March 2013. In the case of a number of those post closures, appeals have been lodged and these are currently in train, but we envisage no more post closures in News and Current Affairs under the Delivering Quality First process. When we wrote to the committee in October, we said that we felt we had already provided a substantial amount of information, as much as we possibly could at the time, on the impact of the licence fee settlement on BBC Scotland and our response through DQF. We did, however, note that we were happy to return at a future date to update on developments, and in the light of the matters that we have in hand, I'm delighted to be here today. We also said it would not be appropriate to enter into discussion on industrial relations matters in a public forum, and that is obviously why I refer to the ongoing appeals process and the importance of that point. In your letter to the chairman of the BBC, convener, you indicated that the committee is now considering a report on the ability of BBC Scotland to manage major events. As the chairman outlined in his response, we're very happy to attend to answer any questions that the committee may have in this respect, and I hope that we can do so in a spirit of cooperation and in the knowledge that we are all endeavouring to produce the best possible output for audiences here in Scotland. In conclusion, major events are very much front of mind for us, following on from our coverage of the Olympics, which received considerable praise. Our firm desire is to use the expertise that we gained in the Olympics as we prepare for next year. 2014 is a year in which we'll cover not only the Commonwealth Games and the independence referendum, but also World War I commemorations and a host of other events, and our planning for these major events is already well in hand. So, in short, I'm confident that we are well placed to manage the challenges that we currently face and those that we will face going forward. 2012 was one of our most successful years to date, and I have no reason to think that we will not continue on that path this year, next year and beyond. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much, Mr MacQuarrie, and I'm sure the committee recognises the difficulties that BBC Scotland faces in the current financial climate that you face. But clearly there are a number of matters raised with us in the autumn of last year which we wish to address. I'm going to try and manage this situation as best we can over the evidence and deal with each area as we go through it. But I want to start off, if you don't mind, with the letter you sent to us on the 30th of October, I believe it was, in relation to the trade unions' evidence to the committee earlier that month. At point 3 in that letter, you quote Mr Murray talking about, in his view, that in Radio News and Current Affairs has had a staff cut of 60%. You say this is simply not true. Could you explain to us? I mean, that's clearly, there's clearly a very divergent position there between yourselves and Mr Murray representing one of the trade unions. Could you explain why, in your view, his statement was incorrect?
Yes, for the detail of the figures in relation to the staff cuts, I'm just going to turn to Mr Boothman.
Can I begin by saying I was quite disappointed in Mr Murray's evidence, to be honest. I was actually quite surprised to see that he was here. I know he has a capacity as being a member of the NUJ executive, but for the record, Mr Murray left the BBC in a voluntary redundancy some 18 months ago, and he's taken no part whatsoever in any management and union meetings in the past year. And I say that not out of disrespect for Mr Murray, but just to lay on the record that that's the case.
That's on the record now, Mr.
Sure.
Boothman, but clearly it's a matter for the unions who they send as their representative.
Yes,
in the same way it's a matter for the BBC who they say.
That's right, and as I said, he's taken no part in any management union meetings in the past 18 months, and that's an important point for us to put on the record. Yes, there have been staff cuts in Radio Scotland in news and current affairs, just as there have been staff cuts across the department. And we recognise that. I came here nearly a year ago and outlined what those were. There is no programme in news and current affairs that has a staff cut of 60%.
Over what time period are you talking?
Well, over what time period? What do you mean? We came here a year ago and discussed these matters. What the time frame that we've been talking about are the 5-year time frame in the last year of continuous improvement through the whole of DQF to 2017. What I'm saying to Mr. Convener is that there is no programme with a staff cut of 60% or anything like it.
Okay, I mean, you've made your position clear. Let me go over the figures that I've been given, and let's see whether we can shed some light on this disagreement. And I'm talking about a time frame between 2006 and 2012, over the last 6 years. And the GMS staffing went from, in 2006, 1 editor, 2 senior broadcast journalists, 3 broadcast journalists and 1 content assistant, to no editor, 1 senior broadcast journalist, 2.5 broadcast journalists and no content assistant. That represents a cut of 50% in posts. So that seems to me, it's not 60%, but it's not 15 or 20%, which was the figure I think that you gave. In terms of daytime staffing, and I could go through them all, but this is a particular one. Daytime staffing in 2006 to 2012 is a cut of some 69%. Weekend staffing 25%, and it will increase as well. And news desk staffing 43%, and at weekends a 60% cut in staffing. Are these figures incorrect?
Yes.
What are the figures then between 2006 and 2012?
Since you've just presented me with those figures, they're not figures that I generally recognise. But look, let me say, for example, to talk about daytime programming, since 2006, there's been an entire new programme added to the schedule, the John Beattie programme at lunchtime, which has got staffing round about it. It is the case that some of the staff who work in that programme also work on the evening news programme, but that for me is value for money. It means that we can have staff working across programmes, which we think is a good thing, just as in Reporting Scotland, the same staff would work on a lunchtime programme and tea time programme. These things are worthwhile. Off the top of my head, for example, you haven't mentioned people like Hugh Williams, who's the dedicated news correspondent to Good Morning Scotland, who's not included in your numbers. We're very, very satisfied with the numbers that we've got round about Good Morning Scotland. It is our flagship news programme. We've added extra output on a Saturday to those programmes. There is no effect on our audience in terms of any of the things that Peter Murray or anybody else has alleged to the committee. I don't have those figures off the top of my head, right? But I'm quite happy we've got a satisfactory number of staff round about the programmes. I outlined a year ago that yes, there would be a period we would go through when staff would be working across our output, but what's happening in radio in relation to that has been happening in television and other areas for a very long time.
I'm quite surprised by your response. I mean, the figures laid out that I have been given are fairly detailed in terms of the actual posts, dedicated posts, which used to have on GMS or in other parts of your service, which no longer exist. So I'm quite surprised that you seem to suggest that these figures are incorrect. Can I move on?
Mr. Convener, again, if you wish to present me with these figures, right, because these figures are new to me, they have never been presented in the form that you've presented them to us by the trade unions in BBC Scotland, I'm happy to have a look at them.
Well, I'm sure you can read the official report and those figures will be available to you there, but I'm happy to provide them with you.
I'm happy to do that, but let me tell you, in the form that you're suggesting, these figures have never been presented to us in any management union meetings at BBC Scotland.
Let's take some specifics. Does GMS currently have a dedicated editor?
No.
The Day Shift? No, it doesn't. And did it used to have?
Yes.
Right. So so that figure's correct. The one I read
Yes.
earlier.
So what is the implication of what you're saying? Are you saying that you don't think that there's proper editorial control over GMS?
No, the implication is that I read out the figures and you said they were incorrect. And so I was going through them, if you wish, one by one.
Okay, on you go.
You've said that was correct. There used to be 2 senior broadcast journalists on GMS and Day Shift. There's now 1. Is that correct?
No, it's not correct.
What is the situation?
We would probably have... What do we have? We certainly have a senior broadcast journalist who works overnight, and there would be another senior broadcast journalist who would be on daytime. It's not, you're exclusively talking about during the day. GMS has staff obviously planning the night before as well as on the day of the morning of the programme itself.
Would that be the early shift staff you're talking about there?
No, well, there's an overnight staff.
Can I ask then therefore about, let's look at some other programmes. Newsnight Scotland used to have until fairly recently 2 correspondents with 2 days work on a story. And I believe the current plan is to remove those current posts. Is that correct?
No.
So
Newsnight Scotland still has that level of staffing.
And the plan is not to remove them?
We haven't talked in detail to the staff what the plan will be.
Sorry, is there a plan to change the current number of staffing on Newsnight Scotland?
Is there a plan? Yes, there is, yes.
So, and that will be a reduction?
We'll discuss that with the unions and the staff.
Right. So at the moment you're not able to say what that reduction will be?
Convener, I don't think it would be appropriate for me to discuss details, right, of staffing on a programme like Newsnight Scotland without discussing it with the unions and the staff first.
I think that's entirely appropriate, but I'm slightly, again, surprised because we're at the end of January. You said all these posts will be going by March, and you say you haven't yet discussed it with the unions. The posts that we're talking about in terms of our DQF process will be going by the end of March. Yeah. But given it's the end of January, I mean, I'm slightly surprised that you haven't yet discussed that with the unions. I haven't discussed individual details. We've got, in fact, a meeting with the unions tomorrow or the next day, a DLM meeting, and then we've got local level negotiating meetings coming up. Mm-hmm. But none of the changes that you're talking about have been suggested to the staff. Okay, Neil Finlay.
Okay. Could I ask, in terms of the exchanges that we've seen in the letter that you responded to the trade unions, how are industrial relations and morale at the BBC?
2 days ago, we had directors' liaison meeting with the joint unions. Paul Holleran attended that. It was a very full meeting. We were discussing the totality of our business across BBC Scotland. These are regular meetings that take place between myself as director and the joint unions. The tone and the atmosphere of that meeting was the positive, convivial. Paul Holleran paid tribute to the good work that was being done in terms of attempts to redeploy the staff in BBC Scotland who were under a threat of redundancy. I can't characterise the meeting as anything other than positive, which was the most recent piece of evidence I have as an exchange with the unions, Mr. Finlay, in that regard.
The festive period has made people feel a bit better, because that certainly wasn't the impression that we got prior to the festive period. Can I ask, has there been a recent staff survey done at the BBC, and if there is, can we have a look at that? And what was the response to the staff survey, and can we see that?
We will, in terms of the staff survey, there has been a recent staff survey, and we have a plan that we're dealing with all the departments addressing the issues raised within the staff survey. BBC as a whole, as a staff survey, it's not one that's particular to BBC Scotland, but BBC Scotland is part of an overall BBC staff survey.
In terms of the impact in Scotland, is there any way we can see some analysis of that and how people feel about the organisation and and the changes within it?
We'll, obviously the staff survey goes into a level of detail, department by department. We'll respond to the committee, note your request, Mr Findlay, for that, and respond in writing as to what we think is both appropriate and within our overall policy, region by region and area by area across the BBC.
And the spirit of thawing industrial relations, as you say, could that possibly be a joint communication between yourselves and the trade unions so that there's an agreement on what is said?
I think we certainly, in terms of sharing our plans and responding to the staff survey with the unions, we're always happy to take input from the unions, to consult with the unions on that, and we have a regular series of meetings which cover issues like that. It wouldn't be joint, as it's the responsibility of the management to address these issues, any issues that are raised, positive or negative, within the staff survey.
Well, Kavira, maybe if I could ask then that once we receive that the committee ask the trade unions for the comment on the response from the BBC.
I'm sure we'll come back to these issues as we go through. Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Convener. I'm sure you're aware that the Scotsman this morning is an article in it saying that the likelihood of strike is quite high in the BBC amongst news journalists.
I missed a couple of words, I'm sorry.
Sorry, you'll be aware that the Scotsman has an article this morning suggesting that relations are at the point where there may be a strike in the very near future amongst news staff. Have the staff been given a public opportunity to discuss these issues with you? And if so, could that meeting also be described as positive and convivial?
That a number of opportunities for the staff are both either with the direct leadership of the area that the staff are in, and you're referring particularly to industrial. Are you referring particularly to the staff survey or to industrial relations, as it were?
Particularly, have the staff been able to raise their concerns regarding, obviously it's in the Scotsman rather today, that tensions are very high. So has there been a public meeting or a meeting of staff at which they have been able to not public meeting, but a meeting of staff with yourself where they've had a chance to hear these views?
Well, I recently had an open session with staff, which was open to all staff to come, where we had a very full discussion on a number of different issues, and these ranged from the impact of Savile through to the DQF, the impact of DQF, and how would I characterise the meeting was open, honest, on both sides. Let me put it this way: the staff who attended that, many of them from the newsroom, came up to me afterwards and said they felt it was a very positive exchange and they were very happy with the exchange. So and these are staff who owe no fear or favour, if you like. There's no reason to say that. That would characterise the tone. That doesn't imply that it wasn't, in any sense, that it wasn't a robust exchange of views, because it was.
Okay, thank you.
Smith.
Mr McCormac, could I ask you about the quality judgments, specifically?
Sorry, can I just interrupt? I want to stick on the staff survey for a moment. If there are any members who have... Is it on that? Or is
it was related to that.
Sorry,
I'll come back to other people want to go first.
Well, just specifically, I wanted to ask you about the staff survey, as Mr Finlay's raised it, and the morale issue. There was a staff survey in 2010, was there not? I'll just quote two statistics from it. And on the response to the question, I believe that my manager means what he or she says, the BBC average saying yes was 67%. The Scottish News Department, BBC Scotland News Department, was 41%. And in response to the question, senior leaders in my division behave in a way that is consistent with the BBC values. The BBC average was yes, 45%. BBC Scotland News was 17%. Do you not? I mean, you're not shocked by that particular figure. And I just wonder, given only 17% felt that their senior leaders behaved in a way that was consistent with BBC values, what have you done in response to that survey, and how have you dealt with what is, in my view, I mean, an appallingly low figure?
I think in terms of the staff survey, we obviously take seriously any staff survey, any data that we have about how our staff are feeling. And we have a very clear action plan which involves dialogue, working with staff to ensure that the various fora for their concerns are there, that there's absolute clarity in terms of the information that's available to them, and we respond as any organisation would, with a positive plan to address the issues raised. So that's in sum how we approach it.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things I'm slightly puzzled by that response, because you understand that in advance of this meeting, a number of people have spoken to me, a reasonable number, and the one thing that they all said consistently across every communication I've had was that there was, in their view, a complete lack of communication by management at BBC Scotland, that they weren't being told things, that issues were not being addressed, that they were not being dealt with or responded to, they were not being informed about what was going on, and that morale was at a rock bottom low. And that's now, and it was at 17% in response to that question 2 years ago, or nearly 3 years ago now. You know, how can you respond in the way you've just done, given that figure a couple of years ago, and the kind of responses that I've had, and I'm sure other members have had in advance of this meeting?
I think you're quoting a particular department, is that correct?
It's BBC Scotland News. Yeah.
From News. We respond in looking across the whole of BBC Scotland. News is part of the operation. We look at our figures in relation to other nations, other parts of the BBC. Broadly, in the recent staff survey, the highest scoring area was Salford, with the new setup in Salford. We're broadly in line across the rest of the BBC. I don't for a moment minimise the importance of looking at these statistics, taking cognizance of them and addressing them, and that we do in an absolutely open fashion with the staff. And although you say that the results have not, that you indicate that there's a lack of communication with the staff, we've communicated the staff results very clearly, and there's a regular communication with the staff. We have a regular system, we have internal communications as any organisation has, and we work all the time on getting the optimum internal communications, responding to what staff's needs are, being accessible and available at any point the staff want to raise an issue, as any organisation would.
Okay, thank you for that. Can I, just for clarity on the point that was raised a moment ago, in terms of the most recent staff survey, when will the departmental breakdown be published?
That I'll come back to you with a figure on that, but we're looking at already at giving various heads, giving the figures have been available to individual heads within their own areas and within their own departments, and they're using them for the basis for the team briefings.
So does that mean they'll be available soon, published soon?
We'll take soon, certainly, but I'm not going to give a figure exactly on that until we've completed the work internally.
No, I understand that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Liz Smith.
Thank you, Convener. Just to follow on from this, in the question about quality, which is obviously the most important thing about the standards of programmes, and particularly in light of the very serious concerns of the Saville report, can you tell us a little bit about the criteria by which you make judgments on the quality of the programmes that are delivered?
We do a variety of surveys on the quality. The one is what we call the AI index, which is gives a qualitative score, for programmes. So typically we're measuring reach and share and the quality of the programme. We're also have various bespoke surveys where we look at whether the programme was regarded as innovative, and there's a parallel work is carried on by the BBC Trust, particularly in that regard, what's referred to as fresh and new. So these are the sort of areas that we measure. We're looking at originality, impact, to what extent the audience enjoyed the programme, would they recommend it to a friend is often something we measure in online, So in radio, TV and television, we have different systems according to the platform to try and get the best data available. And we have really, it's something that we do with the utmost seriousness, and I think we probably have more qualitative data on our programming than any other organisation in the UK.
Right. Could I ask then, are you satisfied with the results of these analyses of the quality? And secondly, are there any concerns about the quality of programmes, whether that's amongst management or amongst staff?
I think we continually aspire to try and both hold the quality and also improve the quality. When we look, as the Director General said when we were here in May, we can see a rising graph on the qualitative scores, and that is obtained as far as the output.
On all the scores?
On all the scores, as far as the output is concerned. Now, there's no doubt, that the issues around Savile affected trust in the organisation as a corporate body, if you like, and we measured that as well. However, the audience distinguish between, if you like, the corporate, the BBC corporately, and also the content. Our content scores on the sort of magnificent programmes such as Africa. We mentioned Mrs. Brown's Boys. It's had record scores in terms of enjoyment of the audience, in terms of comedy. So regularly, with each programme, we analyse the qualitative scores, look across a whole range of different criteria, and also look at the extent to which the audience are using the iPlayer for a programme, in other words, to view it again. And we take all of that data and rigorously test it. In no sense are we ever complacent about quality, because it is what we live to deliver, is the quality of our programmes.
Just finally, Mr McCormac, would I be correct in thinking then, given the earlier discussions, that the real concern is not about the quality of the programmes, but it's much more about employment in the sector, the morale within the sector, but it's not a matter of the quality of the programmes that's at stake and causing concern amongst staff?
I think given that we have, to the benefit of the licence payer, have a frozen licence fee since 2010, which until March 2017 we will be able to offer the licence payer exactly the same payment over that period of time. Taking that in concert with the responsibilities which the BBC has taken on board in terms of World Service, S4C, BBC monitoring, local television, etc. Taking that and taking over £700 million over that period out of the budget, I don't for a moment, I said that the last time I was here, that this is not easy, it is difficult to do, and it causes uncertainty for staff in an organisation that's going through that level of change. Allied to that, we're also in the most competitive industry, perhaps in the UK, in terms of the number of competitors we have, but also probably in terms of the way that the audience behave and use technology, the fastest changing industry in the UK.
Thank you.
Colin Beattie.
It's all right to move on to another subject, is it?
This one for the moment. I don't know, Joan, are you on this one or a different one?
Well, I wanted to talk about benchmarking
We'll come
between
back to
Radio
that
Scotland
then.
and Radio 4.
Is it the same area?
Yeah,
Right, it's Claire and then you open it.
Thank you, Convener. You mentioned about benchmarking against other areas of the BBC, but have in front of me figures from the BBC Trust, the National Radio Review, and I suppose the ultimate judgment of quality is actually the listening figures, if you like, for radio. And that shows that between 2007 and 2012, the budget was cut from, and content delivery was cut from 29.5 million to 23.2 million, almost 20% cut. And worryingly, at the same time, the listening figures dropped by 11,000 in that period. Whereas in comparison, when you look at Radio 4, it actually increased its listening figures at that time. So given that there has already been quite a substantial cut to content in this area, how is going forward, can you be assured that there is the capacity to continue to deliver quality programming in that context?
Are you talking specifically on radio?
Yes.
On radio. It's a constant discussion for us to, first of all, to ensure that we innovate, we refresh the schedules, we have new programming in. I think we've, since over the last couple of years, we've had more than 50 new dramas which we've been able to bring since we brought drama back into the schedules for Radio Scotland. We looked at the Billy Kay's programme, The Cause, which I know that was well received by some members of this committee. We are constantly looking at innovative documentary, but also in terms of our news, our specialist news, our religious programming have won awards. Our sports output over that period has also been in receipt of awards. So it's, if you like, the holy grail for us as far as continuing to drive the quality up as far as Radio Scotland is concerned, to also to offer, as we do, programming to the UK networks, which whether that's for Radio 3 in terms of classical music, we're delighted with the success of our orchestra. We were able to protect the orchestra to a large extent within the whole of the DQF process. We're delighted with the range of programming, particularly that we're offering to Radio 4. They have a very, very trusted and strong relationship with the staff in BBC Scotland. So in all of that, we're giving opportunities to develop staff, to refresh staff, and to produce a range of new programming. And that is across each and every genre. We're also proud of this week what we're delivering in terms of Celtic Connections, reflecting the 20th anniversary of Celtic Connections. And that's something that we will continue to do and offer the expertise and the specialist music expertise that comes in the evenings on Radio Scotland. As a consequence of the trust, the license review, service license review, we're doing more speech in the daytime and making sure that the offer is much more of a speech-based offer during the daytime.
Could I have a supplementary, convener? Mm-hmm. Yeah. You mentioned the World Service, and obviously part of where we are is the fact that the funding for the World Service is now coming fully from the licence fee. As we're moving forward to 2014 and the big events in that area, what relationship change has there been with the World Service, if you like, and what opportunity is there for BBC Scotland to work with the World Service and ensure that what's happening in Scotland is being broadcast in the World Service? And you also mentioned technology, so a quick one on the technology in the iPlayer. There's still a distinct lack of Scottish content in the iPlayer, and I'm switching from radio now, but you can't watch the Politics Scotland on the iPlayer. And obviously there's quite a bit of international interest in what's happening in Scotland at the moment, and I find no valid explanation as to why there isn't more Scottish content on the iPlayer.
Can I start by talking about both the World Service and the big things that have been happening in BBC World Television and the relationship of BBC Scotland and news to both of those? As some of the committee might be aware, one of my colleagues, Glenn Campbell, has been working in London with the World Service over the past 3 months, cementing the very good relationship that we have now with the World Service. And if I can use as an illustration of that, one of the most successful programmes in news and current affairs in recent months was a documentary that we made with Martha Payne from Argyll, a documentary called Martha Meals in Malawi, where our reporter Laura Bicker went with Martha Payne and her family to Malawi. That programme in the past achieved that programme achieved an audience of 350,000 on BBC Scotland, and in the past it would only ever have got probably one showing on BBC Scotland. As it happened, we recut the programme and we put it out again in a different version at Christmas. partly as a result of a relationship with BBC World. On television, the programme received, I think it was 12 showings on BBC World, going out in America, going out in China, and I don't know if anybody saw the programme, but within that programme there were a series of people from different parts of the world who had followed Martha's example, and I think this was a result of the relationships I'm talking about. The programme also had the same number of showings on the BBC News channel, one I think in October when it went out, and secondly when the recut version went out in December. So this is part of the new and developing relationship that we are trying to achieve with World Service, with the BBC World Service, and with television and BBC World as well. We've developed that quite a lot in relation to some of the other investigations programmes that we make in BBC Scotland, where, for example, the whisky programme that I heard Miss McAlpine commend on television at the weekend had 7 showings, I think, on the BBC News channel a couple of weeks ago. Now, all of these things in terms of telling Scotland's story to the world are actually new in the past couple of years, and in order to cement that relationship further, one of my colleagues, the editor of our investigations team, Marcus Ryder, was away talking to, has been in the past couple of months talking to people in World Service television and radio, and also in the news channel, to cement that relationship and to make sure that all of the investigations that we make in BBC Scotland purely for a domestic audience are now going to appear in a much wider place. The Martha story also featured quite significantly, can I say, in terms of World Service Radio. They had carried out a series of items in relation to school meals around the world. So this story, which started off as a simple news story in Argyll, well, at the end of the day has travelled the world. But let me say to you, that particular story, in the way we used to operate a couple of years ago, would have been confined only to Scotland.
An answer about the iPlayer, sorry.
A brief answer about the iPlayer, if possible.
Well, we've a huge amount of content from BBC Scotland on the iPlayer. We will continue to make sure that we increase that so that absolutely everything that we have is on the iPlayer or available to view again. The overall mission of the BBC is to give all audiences with the maximum convenience and the maximum quality within the 7-day window the chance to view.
Amongst the political and media classes, there is a view that Good Morning Scotland in particular is creaking at the seams, and so my question really is about the quality of it and how you compare that against Radio 5 and Radio 4.
First of all, there are 2 ways of comparing quality. One, there's clearly an element of subjectivity when individuals make a pronouncement about Good Morning Scotland, but we try and measure the data that we have as far as the behaviour of our audiences are concerned for Good Morning Scotland, and the audiences are holding steady for Good Morning Scotland. We continually want to refresh both the diet of the programming to make sure that we're listening to the audience, offering the audience what they both need from the programme and also what they find essential in terms of the information. I believe the programme does that, and the staff on the programme and the presenters of the programme do that in an excellent fashion. And I think the fact that but the essential of assessing quality is to do that by measuring the audience response to the programme.
Yeah, so Mr. Findlay, can I come in there? I mean, I think it's when I came here a year ago. In fact, it's almost a year since I came here. One of the big items that people wanted to talk about was the change in our schedules at the weekend. There had been much criticism among politicians and the media alike of that, And what I believe, although the changes just happened in the autumn, is that we've got a much stronger offering now at the weekend than we've ever had before. On Saturday, that included the creation of a new 2-hour Good Morning Scotland with Derek Bateman and Isabel Fraser. And I don't know if the committee has any views of this or any individuals. I think it's a terrific offering, and I think it's much better, as I say, than it's been before. For me, Good Morning Scotland provides an incredible service, not just in terms of reporting what's happening Scotland domestically, but across the UK and internationally. It's got, as we've said here before, access to the BBC's expertise all around the world, and journalists appear regularly from the BBC coterie of correspondents around the world. We broke some incredible stuff in reporting in Good Morning Scotland last week. My colleague again, Glenn Campbell, was in the Czech Republic and he was in Slovakia. We had an interview about independence and what it meant in terms of Czechoslovakia with the Deputy Prime Minister of Slovakia, followed the next day by an interview with the Czech Foreign Minister. This is just one example of some of the things that you can expect. Well, we've seen already and can expect in the next few months from Good Morning Scotland. Good Morning Scotland's a first-class programme, and as Kenny says, the audiences are holding up. In that respect, we are very proud of it.
I mean, these are some of what I'm saying is anecdotal from people who are commenting on it. One of the issues that gets raised is that people may tune in for a very short period, listen to 15 minutes or whatever, and then they tune into 5 Live or Radio 4. Is there any way in which you can track whether that's happening, or is there any way you can assess whether that's happening, or whether people are sticking with the programme for longer periods?
So I'm unashamedly in favour of that, insofar as the BBC is offering to audiences in Scotland a choice. For me, there's nothing wrong with that. At the end of the day, if people are tuning in to Good Morning Scotland to hear what's happening either locally or in Scotland, and they choose to tune in to Radio 4 for something else, or 5 Live for something else, then that's fine. I mean, I listened to Good Morning Scotland from 6 o'clock this morning, and I thought it was absolutely terrific because we had 2 first-class reports from local correspondents about the weather situation in Grampian, what was happening in terms of schools and roads and everything else. I then listened to another correspondent in the programme from the Borders doing the same. I then had a dose of what was happening in the international situation, and yeah, sometimes I do myself dip in to 5 Live and the Today programme, and that's the choice the BBC provides, and we're very proud of that.
Okay.
Joan McAlpine.
Yes, if I could just, thank you very much, Convener, perhaps talk a little bit more about this issue of benchmarking between particularly Radio Scotland and Radio 4. When we asked Ian McWhirter, when he came before the committee in January, whether, to the best of his knowledge, any proper benchmarking exercise had ever been undertaken, he said that he once raised the issue with a senior BBC executive who told me that Scotland has 1/10 of the population, so only gets 1/10 of the budget for the programmes, so the programmes are made at 1/10 of the cost. Is that accurate?
I think we talked about this last time we were here, and no, it isn't accurate. It's way from accurate. So at the moment, we believe that, as Mark said last time he was here, the budget for Radio 4 is about 3 times the size of Radio Scotland, and the audience for Radio 4 is about 16 times the size. That was the answer we gave last time to that question.
But how do you benchmark between the different programmes?
As we said last time, we do it with numbers sometimes, and we do it with meetings. Radio people meet. Jeff sits in a radio network controllers group, Jeff Zinsky, and we share the information about how things are staffed and how things are run, and we try and share best practice.
Right, because figures we've been given, just as one example, is the World at 1 and PM staffing compared to John Beattie and News Drive. The World at 1 and PM has 2 editors, 6 broadcast journalists and 1 assistant, whereas they're on air for an hour and 3/4, and Johnny Beattie and News Drive are on air for double that time, and yet they have half the staff.
Well, in terms of the figures that you have there, we're happy to, if you provide us with these figures, we're happy to respond later in a detailed analysis of these figures. But if you're asking, is there a difference between the staffing on, for example, the Today programme versus Good Morning Scotland, as the Director General said, yes, there is. The remits of the programmes are subtly different in that regard, and I think that we have been clear on that. But the figure, I do not recognise the tenth of the budget figure that you mentioned that Ian said, a senior executive had said to him.
So will you give us a breakdown of the staffing on the Johnny BT and News Drive programmes compared to the World at 1 and PM? You'll write to the committee in with those figures?
What I'd like to do is to see the figures and then look in terms of to assist the committee as best we can while not revealing what would be reasonable information for us to withhold from commercial competitors.
I could just go back to the my colleague Claire Adamson mentioned the BBC Trust review of radio. There was a BBC Trust service review of network radio and a separate one on Nations Radio in 2011. Yeah. Now, if you look at the funding, and I think it's difficult to get away from funding, as my colleague Claire Adamson said, the funding for Radio Scotland was cut from 29.5 million in 07-08 to 23.8 million in 10-11, and over the same period Radio 4's budget grew. Radio 4's budget grew from 81 to 86 million, and the budget, as we've been told in Delivering Quality First, the budget for Radio 4 is going to be preserved because it's a jewel in the crown of broadcasting. As head of BBC Scotland, does that not strike you as a little unfair that your jewel in the crown, Radio Scotland, is already had a severe cut in its budget, is going to get more cuts in its budget, whereas the equivalent Radio 4 is protected?
Can I just answer on that? We talked about Radio 4 last time in this, and the facts are 20% is the average BBC savings, 16% is BBC Scotland's. Radio Scotland has a saving about 13 or 14% over the period, and Radio 4 has a saving about 11%. So there is a small difference of 3-4% in the savings targets for Radio 4 and Radio Scotland.
Well, with all due respect, that's not actually what the figures say in Delivering Quality First. They don't show it. They show a cut for Radio Scotland, but they don't show a cut for Radio 4.
Where do you get the figures for?
That's from the BBC Trust.
These are historic figures. These are not the figures to 2017. I don't think it's not figures I recognise anyway. There is
right.
As far as
well, we know from the service reviews that that Radio Scotland's budget in cash terms has been cut, and Radio 4's budget in cash terms has grown. You can't dispute that.
I think I'd like to see what's included in Radio 4, to do a like-by-like comparison as far as that's concerned, and to see whether 4 Extra, for example, the new Radio 4 service is included in that or not.
Right. If in those service reviews, there was some audience research done as well, and the audience research for Radio 4, which was generally positive. But one of the things that listeners did say was, to quote the service review, that Radio 4 was perceived as a very metropolitan and very London-centric station, and it had a penetration of just 12% in Scotland, but it was 28.8% in England, and the audience review showed that was tended to be biased towards the south of England, so it would be even higher in the south of England. In Scotland, Radio Scotland's penetration was higher than Radio 4's in England. Given that profile of the station, do you think it's wrong? Don't you think it's wrong that it's the Radio 4 that's getting its budget protected and its budget rose over the same period as Radio Scotland's budget was cut?
I think that the cuts or the efficiency savings that we mentioned in terms of the 13 to 14% versus 11 are comparable. They're in the same territory. In terms of Radio 4, the bias that you referred to in the South East, that successive controllers have been aware of that bias on Radio 4. It's something that Radio 4 works to address. And I think in terms of Radio Scotland's the penetration of the audience, it's the National Radio Service. We're proud of the figures that we get for Radio Scotland, which are just around 1 million listeners per week, second only to Radio 2, which is of course a very popular the music station. These are the performance of Radio Scotland with the audience and the keeping absolutely watchful on the issue of the quality and the performance of the station is what concerns me most. And you could in an organisation such as the BBC, you would get into kind of relative comparisons, between on an organisation of the scale of the BBC, minutely analysing one service versus another. What's important to me is that we do have the ability and the funding in Radio Scotland to deliver its remit. With
all due respect, that's a wee bit waffly, because the figures speak for themselves. Radio Scotland's budget has been cut from 29 to 23 million over the same period that Radio 4's budget has risen. And lo and behold, Radio Scotland's audience figures have fallen, while Radio 4's audience figures have increased in the same period. Surely money must matter.
I think our audience figures have held constant over that period, as far as our data is concerned, in terms of the reach of Radio Scotland.
Sorry, if I can just the Rajar figures. Sorry,
just very brief. Other people are
okay. The Rajar figures for September 1999 to September 2012 show that Radio Scotland's average weekly reach had dropped by 11,000.
I think in terms of Rajar, that in the sort of numbers that we're talking of, the 11,000 out of a reach of circa 1 million. That there is an element of confidence in the radio in any survey or such as Rajar. There's a confidence measure in terms of what the variable of confidence within the data is concerned. It's not statistically significant in that term in these terms of 11,000 out of 1 million.
Thank you. Bobby.
Following on from that, last year when Mark Thompson gave evidence to the committee, he told us that BBC Alba would be exempt from cuts, but BBC Scotland would not. Could you remind the committee of the reasons why that's the case?
Not only was BBC Alba exempt from cuts, but also we wanted to make sure that we had, as I said earlier, the minimum cuts in our orchestra, in the BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra, but also in all of our locally based services areas like Shetland and Orkney. So we took a view in terms of looking at, first of all, the new service that we were just simply launching, which was launched within the context of with a realisation of what sort of economy we're going to be working within, that BBC Alba was delivering as effectively as it was reasonable to expect. And then we did make some in Radio na Gael, which is the Gaelic language radio service. We did make some efficiencies. So these were matters of looking at the budgets, looking at the way that we were working, looking at the output, looking at the service licence and what we had to deliver, and making that as an operational judgment call. And that's what we do day in, day out, week in, week out, and year out.
In terms of quality programming, and obviously the referendum is a major event that will be happening in over a year's time. Could you tell us a bit more about what you mean in terms of quality programme in terms of the referendum? Will this involve high-profile journalists from the rest of the UK, people like Eddie Mayer, Gavin Esler, who are Scottish, coming up to do programming here as well? Is that something that will happen? Is that?
for the referendum, I think that when we were last here, Director General just noted this is one, as I've said publicly, one of the most, for these islands, the most important constitutional event in 300 years. We note its absolute significance as a major story, not only in Scotland, in the UK, globally, and our aspiration and our determination is to cover the referendum with quality, range, depth analysis, and to place in an independent and impartial manner the best information, the best journalism that we possibly can before each and every of the sector of the audiences that I mentioned. And I'm absolutely confident that we will do that. They've got a complete and total determination to do so. John.
Mr Bibby, I mean, if I can put it this way, BBC Scotland will go anywhere, any time, to any place in order to ensure that this referendum is covered properly. I'm very satisfied so far with the programming that BBC Scotland in News and Current Affairs has carried out in terms of our coverage of the referendum. I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of those programmes on radio, television and online. We announced only last week that we were introducing a new fortnightly webcast, the first of which took place on Friday with Blair Jenkins, the leader of the Yes Scotland campaign. He will be followed in a fortnight by Blair McDougall, the chief executive of the Better Together campaign. And what we, as Kenny says, hope to provide through those webcasts is a range of voices on a range of issues to try to lay out and explain to people who are not just in Scotland but across the UK and anyone who cares to look what the issues are and to make clear what these issues are that people will be voting on in Scotland. We start next Monday with a series of innovative debates on Newsnight Scotland, which will start at 10:30, taking Newsnight UK off there once a month, where we are going to have a debate about what people from ethnic minorities in Scotland, from the Asian, the Chinese, the Polish, the Lithuanian community think of the independence issue, and we'll continue to do those every month. I've mentioned Glenn Campbell in the Czech Republic and Slovakia later this weekend. I'm sure it's not a secret. The Deputy First Minister is going to Dublin, and my colleague Raymond Buchanan will be there as she speaks to the British-Irish Chamber of Commerce. We are looking forward to the visit of to cover it properly, the visit of the Quebec Prime Minister in the next couple of weeks. As many of you will be aware, and this is another good example of how BBC Scotland can tell the story of the Scottish referendum to the world. A year ago, my colleague Glenn Campbell went to Quebec. He came back, we ran a story on GMS and a story on Newsnight Scotland about his interview with Michael Ignatieff, the former Liberal leader. We were surprised the next day to find that that interview was the lead story in the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's 6 o'clock news, and it generated more than 1,500 articles across the whole of Canada, in centrally and across the provinces. Over the next few months, and this is in line, to be honest, with some of the things that we have been doing. Many of you will know that my Gaelic colleague Niall O'Gallagher was in Catalonia twice to cover the story of what was happening in Catalonia in relation to the referendum. He covered that not just for BBC Scotland but for BBC Alba as part of the increasing cooperation of the two arms of BBC Scotland. We plan many of these forays, of course bearing in mind value for money. We do these things in a very efficient way. We plan them very, very carefully, and we go off and do them. So we've come to this point in time. We are gently racking up our coverage of the referendum within our existing output and a wee bit more. There's going to be some landmark things happening in the referendum, as I'm sure you're aware. In the next couple of months, the Electoral Commission, for example, should deliver their version of the question to the Parliament sometime in the next few weeks. At the beginning of March, there's going to be the publication of the referendum bill and the bill for 16 and 17-year-olds to be enfranchised, and obviously we'll probably in those round about those occasions have at least one OB big debate somewhere outside Pacific Quay as we attempt to get to other parts of the country and have these debates, a bit like the debate we had with 16 and 17-year-olds in the Motherwell Theatre in November that Professor Tom Devine took part in. So we're looking forward to the referendum. We've got big plans for it. We can do lots of things in our existing output with our existing capacity, and we're doing them.
Joan, if it's very brief.
Yes, we understand from your written evidence before, in terms of the referendum, that you're going to be applying for fixed term funding. To when are you going to apply for that?
Sorry?
When are you applying for the fixed term funding?
The funding for the referendum has been, we've had a steering group which has been extant for now some 18 months, which involves every division of the BBC. That's making sure that each division understands the importance of this event, that they have the plans in place for this event within their extant output. In addition, as with every other part of the BBC, we will ask for extra investment specific to the referendum, and that's a process that takes place for every single division, every single part of the BBC, and that timescale is ongoing.
It's imminent. We will bid imminently for extra money.
Could you tell us when you're going to be bidding?
It's a time we're working on it just now. It'll be over the next couple of months now.
Right, and when will the extra funding kick in?
Well, some of the funding has already kicked in. There's the referendum and the Commonwealth Games. We already have bid for incremental funding to set up teams, etc. So there are already teams in place, for instance, in the Commonwealth Games, who are funded from the centre.
So in terms of the referendum, are you saying you've already got the extra funding, of the extra funding for the referendum?
The Commonwealth Games, I gave that example.
Right, okay. So when will the extra funding for the referendum come?
If I can come in that. As we told the trade unions, and I think when the trade unions were here in November, there was a little confusion in relation to the evidence they gave. I'm expecting that any funding that we get in for a referendum project will be towards the latter half of this year.
Clarify this point, because
sure.
You're right, there is some confusion
sure.
around it. And I refer back to, I think it's point 7 in your submission in October in reference to the evidence given by the trade unions. And in the last sentence of your response to Mr Murray's comments on the referendum and being business as usual, etc., you say, what we did say was, categorically, was that the money for both the referendum and the Commonwealth Games would not be available now to offset the post closures that are currently required. That's your evidence. You seem to be saying something slightly different. You say the referendum money is not available. You've said that there. You have said the Commonwealth Games money is available.
Just to be clear, what I said is that we have money to set up a project team for the Commonwealth Games. It's a limited number of posts to help with the planning, which has been in place for a few months.
Where did that money come from?
That came from the centre, yeah.
Sorry, what's the centre? Is that?
Well, that's BBC.
BBC London.
The Finance Committee, corporate funding to finance a project team to set up the Commonwealth Games.
So yeah. That's just for clarification. Sorry, just let me clarify. So that's your own post, Mr Malcolm.
Yeah, and two of the others.
And Sharon Mayer and Kevin McCormac, as I understand it, the 3 posts that have been filled. All those posts have been backfilled. So that money has been used effectively to do that, to set up the 3 of you. I don't know if there are others effectively as that Commonwealth Games.
As the first team to plan, to allow us to prepare the finance case and submit that over the next couple of months for the full bid for funding for the Commonwealth Games. Point is, the funding we bid for, we will get the funding over the next month or 2. That doesn't mean the funding kicks in and is all available from then. What we do is we plan that funding and it ramps up over the next period. Obviously, we need a lot more staff during the 11 days of the Commonwealth Games than we do a year beforehand. So we've got a phased plan that we're submitting, and that's the basis of our investment, which will form the funding. And that obviously ramps up for both the referendum and for the Commonwealth Games over the period.
But some money, my guess would be in excess of £200,000, or I would imagine, per year, for these current posts would be is available now, starting now. That's right, isn't it? I mean, your evidence said it wasn't available now.
Yes, there are a limited number of posts funded from now, yeah.
Okay, so some money was available to set up these posts which was Commonwealth Games money, not referendum money. But you said in your evidence that neither of the money would not be available for either the referendum or Commonwealth Games money, which could have been used to effectively smooth out. The reason I'm asking this was, of course, in the previous evidence was that you couldn't or wouldn't effectively smooth out the job losses over a period of time, and they had to be effectively upfront.
But as I've said,
I'm trying to understand, why that couldn't have been the case, that you could smooth out the job losses over several years and use natural wastage, etc., as the way of doing it.
I'll go first, Judge. So the posts that have been funded, as I've said, there's probably 3 or 4 posts been funded. They have been advertised and they are backfilled, and there is an opportunity for staff. And there are particular types of staff. If it's a finance role, it's a finance qualification we look for. So they are available. Whether they will help with any of the proposed redundancies in news, for instance, I would very much doubt, given the nature of the posts, that.
The question was if money was available to do that, to fill those particular posts rather than to create those new posts, but it wasn't available to effectively smooth out the redundancy situation.
All I can speak for is that we need to plan the Commonwealth Games effectively, which I think is what you're asking us to do. We need a team to do that, and that's what we've put in place.
Well, do you not need a team to... I'm glad you said that, because what I'm wondering is, do you not need a team to effectively plan for the biggest... blah, 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 Mr MacQuarrie, that you said in 300 years, that this is the most important, news, current affairs story in 300 years, but you don't have money available for the referendum yet.
Well, John will answer, but just we have a news team. The Commonwealth Games is a one-off thing that the BBC Scotland doesn't normally cover. It's not unreasonable to assume that we need some resourcing and the staffing to set that up. We have an existing news infrastructure and staffing with a head of news and editors, etc., who at the moment are planning the referendum.
Well, let me try, right, and add a wee bit of clarity to this whole thing. I mean, there's really 4 different points. I think in my last answer I illustrated what was meant by business as usual, right? So that there isn't any confusion. Business as usual is doing the kind of things that we announced last week and the other things where we have money available, resources available to organise debates, a new website, various excursions where we can, on a short-term basis, go to different countries, for example, as I illustrated, to basically cover anything relevant to the referendum. So that's the business as usual part. As far as project money goes for the period of the referendum, as I said earlier in a much earlier answer, we've got a plan in terms of where we are now, what coverage we think is appropriate. We think we've done pretty well so far. We are racking it up a wee bit, as I've suggested. I went on to say there are some landmark things happening. I suspect that the next part of our coverage, other than the business as usual type approach, right, which we've adopted so far, where coverage maybe starts to increase a bit, is probably when the Parliament comes back in October next year, this year. That's where we're going to get a referendum, a government white paper. At that point we're probably talking about being a year out from the referendum. You can expect that the BBC will start to cover the referendum really in more depth and more detail, right? And then I suspect, again coming back in January, that's when we really start to be covering at a higher level again. The Electoral Commission tell us in discussions that we've had with them that it will be the middle of June probably, if of course, all of this is quite hypothetical insofar as we don't have a date for the referendum yet. We don't know whether the referendum is going to take place on a Thursday or a Saturday, right? We need that kind of information to inform our planning, but broadly that's where we are and that's where we're going. So as far as business, well, if you bear with me, convener, as far as business as usual and project, that's the kind of timetables that we are talking about. The other thing that's important to understand, and this is directly relevant to the question you addressed to both of us about project teams being in place, apart from the point that Bruce made in relation to the Commonwealth Games being different, there is a point that, well, really, where we are in terms of the Commonwealth Games, and Bruce can say more on this, right, is that we are looking at the moment, new infrastructure. You're talking about providing maybe 15 live streams. As we had live streams during the Olympic, 15 live streams across 14 locations, and all the planning that needs to go into that. We're talking about developing relationships and working out arrangements in terms of how we cover that with staff in London for network coverage, in Salford in relation to some sports coverage, in terms of what all the English nations, regions might want, as well as what BBC Scotland might do itself. All of that means that there needs to be a technical team in place, there needs to be a project team in place to be able to do these things. It's a very, very, very different beast. We've got the whole question of, you know, how much you pay for rights, which has already been dealt with. We've got the whole question of not just relationships with other parts of the BBC to make this in the same Olympic mode work, but the relationship with the host broadcaster, who are not the BBC, we're the domestic rights holder. So it's a very different thing from the referendum. We're very clear where we are at the moment in terms of the referendum, where we want to go to with our coverage. I said a year ago, and this remains, that there will be rich and more in-depth online coverage. There will be debates, there will be documentaries, and where we are is we are, you know, in that phase where we're working out what all of those are going to be, and I'm not at liberty to tell you what they are. And we're also talking to all our colleagues, and not just the network, but all the nations as well. So they're kind of two different things, right, which require two different solutions. Fair, Bruce?
Yes. Thank you very much for that very comprehensive answer. I'm going to have to apologise to members. There's an awful lot of stuff that we didn't manage to cover, but I do want to finish on a couple of questions, so I want to be quick, and hopefully we'll get a quick answer to this before we move on to the next items on the agenda. Can I just try and understand what's happened in the position with local TV? Local TV, 21 pilots across the UK, 2 in Scotland, Glasgow and Edinburgh, funded by or part funded, or material will be bought from these local projects or local pilot TV stations through a £5 million top-sliced fund from the licence fee, £300,000 allocated to Scotland, as I understand it, but STV, I understand, also have said this week that they don't wish to use that because they want to effectively, as I understand it, run it as a commercial operation from day one. That's my understanding of the situation. My question is, the money earmarked for the purchase of local TV in Scotland, the £300,000, what's happening to that?
Well, as far as local TV is concerned, there's 2 tranches, the Edinburgh and Glasgow franchises, which have been delivered, and then 4 other local franchises within Scotland. As far as that money is concerned, we're going to meet with Scottish Television. They have stated, both in terms of after the successful award of the franchises, that they don't wish to participate in that funding mechanism. We'll be meeting to clarify that with Scottish Television. We've got a series of meetings. We meet with them because we have an agreement of a formal partnership with Scottish Television, where we cooperate with across our news gathering. That will be part of the ongoing discussions. Then, once we've had that meeting, and with absolute clarity as the position, we'll have a discussion within the BBC in terms of where that funding is allocated.
Thank you for that. So the £300,000 will be available to BBC Scotland to use, though?
We would have a discussion as to where that money is allocated.
Yeah, I'm trying to clarify, just so we're clear on this, the £300,000 that was allocated to Scotland to purchase local TV, if it's not used for local TV, will be available to BBC Scotland to use for other productions within Scotland or whatever else you want to use it for. Is that the case? Or are you talking about the BBC as in the BBC corporate?
In terms of the allocation of that funding, we have not yet had the discussion with the BBC corporate. The first step will be to have full discussions with STV.
I understand that. I'm trying to figure out where the money's going.
In terms of the planning, if you're asking for an assurance that the money that STV would have received will come through BBC Scotland, at this point, I cannot give you that assurance.
that worries me, because effectively that was a £300,000 allocation for spend in Scotland, which you're now saying you cannot guarantee will be used by Scotland. That money, effectively, given it's £5 million at the licence fee, Scottish licence fees pay that money, £300,000 coming back. Now it's not coming back.
No, I did not say it wasn't coming back. What I said was I cannot give you the assurance. We've taken, first of all, the position of STV have made the position clear in the light that has just happened very recently. We haven't had a formal meeting yet with STV. We will do so. Then we'll have a formal meeting within the BBC to examine the particular circumstances that obtain. I'm not saying that money will not come to Scotland, but nor am I giving you, convener, just to be straightforward with you, an assurance that it will.
When those meetings take place, will you inform the committee of where the £300,000 went?
I think the BBC will make a statement overall in relation to the funding of local TV, and within that will be included the arrangements for Scotland.
Okay, thank you for that. Just a couple of very, very quick questions. Can I ask about freelance spending on freelancers? Has that been also cut by the 16% over the same period? Has your own core staff have been cut by 16%? Is that happening?
The 16% is a totality, and there will be there will be an impact on freelance. It's not in delivering the 16%, there will be an impact, yes, on the freelance effort that we employ.
Your spend on freelance will go down by an equivalent amount, or roughly equivalent amount, as you do in core staff.
It'll be different in each area. I mean, whether we look at drama, factual, news, radio, there are different plans in each area, and the proportion of freelances in each area differs significantly. It will go down, yes, but not proportionally necessarily.
During the same period, of course, as I mentioned earlier, we have 200 extra jobs coming in Waterloo Road, which so obviously the economy is changing. The Deloitte survey recognised that the fastest area of growth in the UK was in BBC Scotland in terms of contributing to the network economy, and I'm proud of what we've achieved in terms of the value added that I mentioned at the outset, in terms of what the BBC is delivering to Scotland. So these figures have a huge impact on the freelance community in total. But if you're asking me within the local programmes for BBC Scotland, will be an impact on freelance, yes.
Coming on that point, it's very laudable that you are getting this extra spend for network. But in terms of content for Scotland, covering, for example, things that matter to people in Scotland, like the work of this Parliament, where education is fully devolved, you don't seem to be given it the same priority. My understanding is you're not going to have a dedicated education correspondent for Scotland anymore. If you look at the UK-wide coverage of education, which is education in England, you've got Angela Harrison, Sean Coughlin, Catherine Selgin, Judith Burns, Rita Chakrabarti and Hannah Richardson, all covering education. And we're being told that we're not going to have a dedicated education correspondent for Scotland.
Yeah. Education is a big issue in Scotland. I mean, not just in terms of the debate about the curriculum for excellence that's taken place. There's a whole debate around about early years about tuition fees. You're going to look at post-16 education after we've left. Nobody likes doing any of the things that we're having to do in terms of our staffing. And what I will say, because we did mention earlier that there are appeals taking place in relation to what's happening with our staff at the moment, but we took a decision which I think is quite logical, which is to merge the education role with that of local government. I think in future going forward that it will still be possible using the parliamentary staff that we have to cover anything that happens in here in relation to education, as sometimes happens already, and at the same time cover packages, cover stories that happen in the localities with a local government and education correspondent. I mean, because we are not going to have a dedicated education correspondent doesn't mean we're going to stop covering education stories. It means we're going to do them in a different way.
You go, Neil. Sorry.
Just on the back of that, I think I would make the same plea for local government, where we're seeing, you know, local government is being impacted upon massively by the cuts from government, and yet the role of the local government correspondent is being, you know, diminished because the person who covers that also dabbles in energy and business and all the rest of it. So, you know, I just worry that the diminution of that role has a real impact on what's being reported and the concentration on particular local government, which affects people the most of any service.
I think just to follow that, I mean, I think we all share a concern here, which is a concern for a robust, sound, financially stable but proactive BBC rather than a reactive BBC. And I suppose I'm trying to sum up concerns that effectively these cuts will lead to a situation where it's packages from the network and reactive journalism rather than proactive journalism. Is that a fear that you recognise?
Well, look, of course we're concerned about all these things. None of these decisions have been easy, and that's the result of the financial situation that we find ourselves in. What I will say, though, and this is an important point certainly for me to finish on, we've had some great journalism in BBC Scotland in the last year, journalism that exceeds some of the things that have gone before. We've won awards for our programmes in investigations, like our Rangers documentary, which won our Foreign Press Awards for the first time ever, a Foreign Press Awards award for Mark Daly, the person who was the reporter in that story. We won a BAFTA award for that. We are currently engaged in what will be, I'm sure, a very good programme about disability and the new changes to employment and welfare being proposed by the government, which goes out next week. Our investigations, we do 10 of these now on Radio Scotland every year, and that's produced some highlights in the last year, notably a programme by Elizabeth Quigley about pregnancy and degenerative disease. We are doing award-winning journalism at BBC Scotland. We've got some of the most weighty and authoritative journalists working for us: Brian Taylor, our political editor; Douglas Fraser, our business editor; Mark Daly, I've mentioned; people like Colin Blaine, Glenn Gamble, Raymond Buchanan, Pauline McLean, who produces fantastic stories in the arts, and in the past few days, Eleanor Bradford, who's been doing some interesting things in the health service. I'm very proud, of the Department in News and Current Affairs. The picture presented by the unions at the last meeting, for me, was not a true picture of what's happening. I prefer to look at things through the other end of the telescope. I'm very, very, very optimistic going forward of how we can cover the Commonwealth Games and the referendum and all those other things that are happening in 2014, whether it's the 50th anniversary of the Forth Bridge, whether it's the anniversaries of World War I and World War II, whether it's the Edinburgh festivals that we cover very well every year. We are very, very optimistic going forward. Yes, things are not without their challenges and their difficulties. We are where we are. But we think going forward we're going to produce not just a first-class service to our audiences in Scotland, but something that we can be very proud of across the UK, and telling these really, really, really important stories to the rest of the world.
Convener, we've welcomed both the challenge and the scrutiny from the committee, and we've looked at time periods where we've compared budgets year on year and over a 5 or 6 year period. I would ask the committee just to also note the considerable achievements of BBC Scotland by platform and by genre during that same period, whether that be in Waterloo Road or the start of BBC Alapa, or the technology investments that we've made in Pacific Quay, the kind of resource that we've put in across each service, each platform, and the development of our online services. I think there's something there, whether it's drama, children's, factual, investigations, our world-class orchestra under the leadership of Donald Runnicles, something for Scotland to be absolutely proud of. And one thing that I can absolutely assure the committee, that we will deliver output from in 2013 and for 2014 that will thrill the audience, in the events that we've been mentioning, but also meet with the approval of everybody who has a stake in the success and the successful coverage of these events. We've got complete and total determination to do that.
Thank you very much for that. I think we all share those ambitions. BBC Scotland has a proud record, but we want to make sure that that quality and that record is not lost going forward. That is our ambition, I'm sure, as much as it is yours. But can I thank you very much for coming along this morning, and I'll suspend briefly. Our third item this morning is to take formal evidence on the Post-16 Education Scotland Bill, and in a moment we will hear evidence from two panels. The first panel this morning is made up of Professor Gerry McCormac, Principal and Vice-Chancellor of Stirling University, Professor Sir Jim McDonald, Principal in University of Strathclyde, Sir Timothy O'Shea, Principal and Vice-Chancellor, University of Edinburgh, and Professor Seona Reid, Director, Glasgow School of Art. Before we get into the actual questions, can I first apologise for the slight delay in starting this session, and Liz Smith wants to raise a particular point.
Thank you, Convener. As you know, I wrote to you yesterday about two concerns that I have about the scrutiny procedure for this post-16 bill. The first of these is the availability of the evidence, written evidence, which we have received. And I understand there are somewhere in the number of 75 to 80 submissions being made to the committee. We only have some of these available to us, and obviously a very substantial number, I think it was about 50 odd, came to us just at lunchtime yesterday. And I'd just like to point out that I think that that makes our job rather difficult, because it's been very hard for us to ascertain the overall views of the both sectors. But obviously, in terms of the fact that we're taking evidence this morning from people in the higher education sector, it's been difficult to disseminate just how much of the information that we have, you know, the different views in that sector. The second point I would make, Convener, is that in relation to what I think is a very important part of the bill, we have to make a judgment as a committee as to whether to enshrine governance in the legislation that is being proposed or not. And as I understand it, the value judgment we have to make is whether the forthcoming code of governance that will be prepared by the chairs of committee, that's not going to come available to us for 2 months yet. And I feel it's a very difficult thing for us to do, to make that value judgment. In fact, I don't think we can do that without that being available to us. Thank you.
Neil.
Could I agree very strongly with Liz Smith, and we did raise this last week's committee, and I think the situation just remains the same, and that without that document, I think we have great difficulty in scrutinising what's been proposed.
Okay. Can I thank members for raising the issue? I mean, clearly we did raise this matter last week, and can I thank Liz for raising the issue directly with me yesterday. On the first one, obviously, the written evidence that has so far been submitted was supplied to members, as you said, yesterday lunchtime. That isn't enough time to properly go through it for this morning's session. The timetable is very tight, and I accept that, but hopefully members will understand that the information and the evidence was given to them as quickly as possibly it could be. You're quite right, some submissions are not yet with us. Those individuals have asked for an extension. Given that we require that information, I think, to carry out our job, we have agreed to that extension, but we want obviously that information to come to us as quickly as possible in order that we can carry out our work. I also replied yesterday, as you'll be aware, to say that we leave the door open for calling further witnesses as we go through, so that if it's at all necessary, then we can call either witnesses back or new witnesses as appropriate later in the stage 1 process. So I'll leave that door open. That will be very difficult for us, but I'm sure if we wish to do that, we can manage it. On the issue of the code, clearly the bill team last week said that it would be, the intention was to make a draft available, I think it was, by stage 2. The only comment I would make was it's not unusual for codes and guidance, etc., to not be available during the passage of a bill. It's not the first time by any means that I'm sure members have been here a few years will have witnessed this. However, again, I think on this, by the same point on that is that if the committee deems it necessary to call witnesses later on that basis, then we leave the door open for that. Particularly if it's the case, although it's unusual, it can be done. We could call witnesses at stage 2, so that we can take oral evidence on the code directly once it's published. But I think it'd be better to take that decision nearer the time when we see the information that we have in front of us. Okay, can I thank members very much for raising those concerns with me, and can I thank the panel for their indulgence on that. Can I, before we begin, can I ask that not everybody has to answer every question. If you don't need to, please feel free to remain silent on any point that you wish. Obviously, we're trying to take as much information as possible, but there's no point in going over the same ground if it's not necessary. We'll try and keep the questions into particular sections of the bill as we go through it, and I wish to start with university governance, and Liz Smith is going to start us.
Thank you, Convener. Obviously, when Professor von Brzezinski's review was published, the recommendation was that there would be a code of governance set up, and that indications are that the universities were very happy about that suggestion of a proposed Scottish code. I wonder if you could give us your reflections on why you feel that within the bill there has obviously been a proposal to extend the powers of ministers quite considerably further than the recommendations of the von Brzezinski review.
Thank you very much. I'll make a first answer, and then I'll see if any of my colleagues would like to pitch in. Certainly within the universities, we regard the engagement between the chairs of our governing bodies, who of course as principals we're responsible to, and the Scottish Government in terms of a code. We see that as a productive activity. In terms of the legislation, I think this is a good hook for me to express our principal anxiety. I mean, we are very supportive of the whole bill in terms of its intentions with regard to things like widening participation, greater efficiency of the sector, greater accountability. This all makes very good sense to us. At the same time, we are very aware that the Scottish universities are seen as, in world terms, particularly successful, and the outside commentators who comment on that relate that success directly to the responsible autonomy that we discharge. I have in recent years served 4 years on the Strategy Commission of the Excellence Initiative, which is designed to improve the German universities. And recently I had the honour of being the Deputy President of the French Investment dans l'Avenir, which is the French similar endeavour to improve the quality of the French universities in France and Germany. It is very clear. It's also clear in the Republic of Ireland, but it's very explicit in France and Germany, that they find the way our universities discharge their responsible autonomy as one of the key reasons why Scotland is so disproportionately successful as a university system. And our ability to, for example, create subsidiary companies, to engage with each other in partnerships like pooling, without recourse to ministerial control. That is seen really as a key success factor. So I would say we are very supportive of the overall intention, but we are anxious that there might inadvertently be a potential reduction in responsible autonomy, and that some future administration might be in a position where it could intervene in a way that would be unhelpful to the success of the universities in meeting their targets for widening participation and research and such. And I don't know, as this is a fundamental point, whether Sir Jim, you would like to comment as well?
If I may, Chairman Liz, I know there's
going to ask you something on your evidence that you'd submitted, actually.
Just to reiterate, if I may, Stuart, I absolutely agree. It's fundamental that the strong governance, the transparency with which we discharge our responsibilities is there. That's certainly the intention of the review of governance, and I would echo Tim's concerns that we make sure that the balance between our responsible autonomy, which I'm no doubt we'll speak about over the next half hour or so, is in balance between the scrutiny with which we correctly present ourselves, through which we are held to account. But in all of this, I'm sure there are other matters that I should present myself to Liz on.
Just on that point, Professor McDonald, you said very clearly in your own submission to the committee that you felt autonomy was absolutely crucial when it came to innovation, and you gave some examples of how you felt innovation had worked as a result of that. And just to take up the point from Sir Tim, that the whole overall scenario is that the world HE sectors that are doing particularly well are those that have got enhanced autonomy, fairly free of the state. If you look at OECD figures, if you look at World Bank figures, if you look at a whole lot of other statistics, it's those that are free of that. Do you feel it's inappropriate for a government in Scotland to be considering moving in the other direction, where obviously there are to be enhanced powers for ministers?
I welcome your recognition that, if you look at analyse the Shanghai tables of those universities that are performing best in the international stage, those that have a greater degree of autonomy perform better. World Bank has also presented statistics that the panel may well have been aware of. What I would reiterate is that there's no separation between strong governance, absolute autonomy and, as we pursue our strategies, the transparency with which we have to present ourselves, and success. It's the balance that we have to keep in mind. I mean, in my own case, Tim's given you an example from Edinburgh, having the autonomy as an institution 4 years ago allowed Strathclyde to recast its mission as an international technological university. In so doing, our court held us to account, really put us through the mill in terms of evidence-based strategy, as did our students, as did our union colleagues. So in that journey in resetting our strategic intention, we were scrutinised by all of the key stakeholders, including our government partners. And I stress that word, the partnership I value with government and government's agencies is part of our story in Scotland, and it's not something I want to see disturbed. I think it's excellent. We work with SFC, Scottish Enterprise, Highlands and Islands, and I think the context within which Scottish higher education is evolving is one that's a very supportive platform. So going back to the original point, Liz, if I may, I think the governance review is right and proper. It's correct that we are held accountable for the proper execution of our roles, responsibilities and the expenditure that we make. But in all of that, the autonomy of determining a future that serves a government strategic and policy-led purpose is there. The evidence is there in Scotland, and you've seen some of the world-class institutions we have in Scotland, including Edinburgh, is testimony to the value that we're already playing back into the system.
If I may, Convener, could I just pick up that theme? Because that's something that's come through virtually all the submissions that we do have to hand just now from student associations, from staff, from principals, from chairs, that obviously the overall objective is to maintain that excellence within the Scottish universities. And this question of autonomy, or responsible autonomy, to use your phrase, is so appropriate. Just drilling down a little bit further, last week when we had the Bill team in here, and obviously in the submissions that we have to hand, there's been a lot of concern about the distinction between the definitions of governance and management, and there seems to be a very considerable reluctance throughout most of the submissions that it is not appropriate to have management written onto the face of the bill. Could you just explain why you think that that is inappropriate?
I mean, is this distinction, not just the rhetoric of what's the difference between strategic leadership, strategy and management. The management is about delivery of a pre-approved strategy. So where I would like to see that the clear testing of the universities would be is on their strategy, their contribution to an aligned opportunity in Scotland. And management is really inside the machinery of the institution. And I think the policy intentions of the bill as it's been drafted is clear, and we support the principles. I think maybe in drafting we have to make sure there's clarity in terms of the purpose of what we're trying to achieve here. I think this distinction between responsible autonomy, management of the institutions is important, and I think it's clear that if we have the trust and confidence that should be required of the sector and in the sector, I think there's a chance to make sure that it's not about running the organisations, it's about making sure that the strategic alignment and opportunities for Scotland in particular are properly recognised.
Is that the reason why you've asked for the removal of the term management from it, because you fear that taking that too far would impinge on strategic governance and perhaps into the academic work of your institution? Is that the main reason why you've asked for it to be withdrawn?
That's exactly right. Seona?
I really wanted to pick up on Jim's point about the importance of responsible autonomy enabling a diversity of sector that actually you don't see necessarily elsewhere. And coming from a small institution, clearly the nature of the governance and the nature of the management will be different in a small institution than a large institution. However, it will espouse and comply with and support and endorse the same principles of governance. And so the issue of a code of governance is something that I think all universities, whatever size, whatever nature of institution, supports absolutely wholeheartedly. But to enshrine it in legislation risks the possibility that if for future administrations, for example, it could be misused to apply a uniformity of governance model that would be inappropriate to a diverse sector.
May I just finish with one question on this whole issue of diversity? When it comes to the code of governance that is being developed, what is it that you would like to see within that code that is not within the current UK code, but that you don't want to be enshrined in legislation? What's the advantage of having a new Scottish code of governance?
Because I think it can speak to Scotland and, in a sense, the other forms of accountability that exist within Scotland. So it can be specific about the context. But in terms of the set of principles, I think it's quite difficult to see where the principles would differ from the code in the UK.
Finlay?
Yeah, I'm just having difficulty picking up why it would only be possibly future administrations that might misuse the powers of the powers that are given. I've been confused by that. I wonder if you could comment. Obviously, we only got the evidence very late yesterday, but if you could comment on the section from University Scotland who say we don't see a need for the higher education provisions in the bill, which create new and in some cases quite extensive and unspecified powers over higher education institutions. So really what they're saying is there's no need for the bill. Is there a need for the bill?
As we've said and my colleagues have commented on, we see the policy objectives of this bill as laudable. We don't feel that legislation is necessarily required to give that effect, and we think that the sector has been particularly successful on a range of areas, including widening participation in some of the other issues that are addressed within this, without the need for specific legislation. So,
could people just nod if they agree with that? Yeah, that's fine. That will save it. Right. So we've clarified that the panel agree that there's.
Makes it slightly tough for the official report. Right?
Yeah, that's okay. And they all nodded. So therefore, maybe just follow up on that, and that might help you. Therefore, in order to achieve the aims, how can those aims be achieved and ensure they're achieved without the legislation? I know people have spoken about the grant letter and all that kind of stuff. I think this is very key to whether we need this or not, and how you see the aims of it being established without legislation.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. It was to that point. I mean, let me repeat, and you've clearly picked up on it very clearly. I mean, there are existing measures and mechanisms that allow the universities to be properly overseen, to be held to account. You know about the letter of grant, the financial memorandum, but also more recently the outcome agreements, which has been a new introduction led for the government by the Scottish Funding Council, which are some of them very detailed and will evolve. I mean, we've only had a year of the outcome agreements being in place, and of course, because there has been a learning process for the Funding Council and indeed for the sector, we'll be evolving, I think, and refining how outcome agreements sit alongside the autonomous missions of the institutions. And that's, I remind us, there's the context within which these outcome agreements have developed. It's been individual institutions making commitments on widening access, knowledge exchange, patterns of provision. But just now, through the conditions of grant, through the memorandum that sits alongside it, and the outcome agreements, the mechanisms are there, we believe, to allow us to be held to account and to deliver and add value for the public expenditure that's made in the universities.
Can I go back to that? Some institutions have failed miserably on extending access, opening up access. So if what you're suggesting, would that change? Would that force them to change?
I wouldn't accept that premise, if you don't mind me saying. I think every university that I'm aware of works hard to make sure there's diversity in the population of students that they have in their university. I think you've seen a great deal of innovation over the past few years, not just through outcome agreements. Those have certainly focused some attention, but there's been plenty of innovation, plenty of engagement with society and broader socio-economic communities over the past few years. So failure, I don't recognise that. In fact, quite the opposite. I would say there's a great deal to commend the sector at large in different ways. As Seona has mentioned, there's been no single approach to this in terms of widening participation. I think some of the value here is that there's been a great deal of innovation, which in some part has been informing the sector broadly from different universities innovating and what they're doing in that context.
I may be missing something, but 2.2% of Aberdeen students from the most deprived data zones, 2.6% at St Andrews. I don't see what measure, I don't know a measure of success that we could ally that to.
Deputy Convener, I would have to say that the universities would not accept your notion that we had failed miserably. SAMD 20 is one available measure. There are a variety of measures which have to be taken. And SAMD 20 is a very imperfect measure because it is a postcode measure. Other measures that are available are family income, and whether that is low, and a residual family income. We do that very strongly at the University of Edinburgh. Another measure is whether the family has ever had anybody to university. Another measure is whether the student is at a low achieving school in terms of university success. Another measure is overall family context and, for example, whether or not the potential student has very serious caring responsibilities. If you look at the University of Edinburgh, we are the key leader in the Lothian Equal Access Project for schools. Last year it had 1,200 participants who were not expected to go to university, who went on to university level study at different universities in Lothian, this is led by us, of whom nearly a third, 371, went to the University of Edinburgh. In terms of the Scottish Higher Education Partnership, the University of Edinburgh took in 130. In terms of our very innovative pathway to the professions scheme, whereby students who are medical or law or architecture graduates partner with students who are not expected to go to university. Last year, 62 entered via that route. In terms of adult returners, as far as the University of Edinburgh goes, we had 93 successfully entering. And if you look at bursary provision, the University of Edinburgh, for new entrants last year, gave out more than 1,000 substantial bursaries and scholarships. And that success and that commitment is demonstrated across the sector. So we would not accept your characterisation, which is based on a very single measure, which does not capture the access needs. And for example, if we took the measure that you suggest, Deputy Convener, it would tell us there are no access students at all in Shetland, because there are no SAMD 20. I do think this debate has to be conducted in a proper way, looking at the whole range of measures. The commitment of the Scottish universities to widening participation is total, and we have had demonstrable success over the last 10 years.
I use these figures because these are the figures that have been presented to us, and I'm sure that the other criteria that you suggest are relevant. I've no doubt about that. I would suggest, though, that part of the reason why the government is seeking to legislate is because of, with respect, the approach that you are presenting to us today, that they feel that things haven't gone far enough, therefore they feel as though they're going to have to legislate for that. I think that is the reality of things.
I'm sorry, Deputy Convener, we have all voluntarily engaged in outcome agreements which have got very explicit targets with regard to widening participation. Sure.
I was actually just going to give some figures from the sector. There has actually, over the last 6-year period, there's been a 16.9% increase in SIMD 20 university students. That's 3,053 more students from those postcodes than were at university 6 years ago. So the figures, I think, are misleading in the terms that they're being presented. There's also been an increase in state school participation, and there's been an increase in the number of entrants to full-time undergraduate degrees with socioeconomic classifications of 4 to 7. So using both SIMD 20 and other indices, the numbers of students coming from those most deprived backgrounds are actually increasing. And they're increasing in response to all the programmes that every university is doing. But these are not easy wins, and I think we need to recognise that you're talking about, particularly in Glasgow, you're talking about schools where 4% of the students leaving those schools will go into higher education. Now that's that's a very, very low figure, and all our work is about trying to work with partners in education, with partners in further education, to try and increase that figure, increase the aspirations, and increase the bridging activities that allow us to take raised aspirations and get them into higher education, whatever that higher education may be.
And if I may, just a brief point to give you some of the evidence base. some of which will be with you, Neil, some of it won't. Just to reiterate Seona's part, many of the initiatives that you'll be counting up have predated outcome agreements, and that shows that the sector has been, based on responsible autonomy, have been working together as well as individually. My own institutions, Strathclyde, between 10 and 11, 11-12, we grew our MD40 entry to first year from 687 people to 736, and we seek to grow that further. Amongst the research intensives, we have the highest number of MD20 entrants into the university, and I'm proud of that. It's part of our social mission, and I'm sure other universities recognise their role in supporting gifted young people, regardless of socioeconomic background, achieving their potential in the university. So, of course, the sector wants to do more, and I think you've seen from the universal sign-up that the principals have had to the principles of widening access, that we're keen to push this on as a strategic objective for us individually and to help serve the government's objectives here to try and make sure that we produce more school leavers ready for university and indeed ready for the workforce as we build up a knowledge-based economy.
Yeah, I'm aware of Strathclyde's long-standing commitment to widening access. You even let me in.
Could I also make one or two comments on this? At the University of Stirling in 2006-07, we had 538 students admitted from SIMD Fforde. In 2010-11, that was 710 students. And just through this this recent outcome agreement that we've had with the Scottish Funding Council, we have increased, again agreed to increase the number of students by 135 from these categories during the year and put on special courses during the summer to ensure not only that they enter university, but they actually succeed and are retained in the sector and go on to complete their studies, because I think that's a crucially important part, and all of my colleagues in all of the universities in Scotland put enormous effort in, not only to ensuring that we admit students into the university, but putting the effort into making sure those students have a successful experience and exit the university with a qualification.
We have strayed into widening access here, which I want to come on to in a minute. I want to bring us back to governance. You mentioned, Timothy, in your opening response, you talked about pooling and you talked about subsidiary companies as a couple of examples of what autonomy brings you or allows you to achieve. Could you explain in what way a Scottish Code of Good Governance would interfere with that activity?
It might not, but it would seem to us that the vector that we currently have, which is a negotiation between the chairs, and we're as principals accountable to the chairs, and the Scottish Government for a voluntary code, is the appropriate way forward.
Right. So you don't have evidence that effectively any kind of code of good governance would impact on the ability of your organisations to actually continue to carry out that kind of work.
I mean, it all depends what the shape of it is. I mean, you know, if you were to give me, and I do spend some of my time giving advice to other higher education systems, as I indicated, particularly Germany and France. I mean, if you were to set me the task of writing a governance code that reduced autonomy and the ability to, I mean, for example, many of the German universities cannot set up subsidiaries. I could do that for you if you wanted. Or if you set me the task of writing out a governance code that increased the autonomy of universities, I could do that too.
Yes. Is it your expectation that any code of governance that comes forward would reduce your ability to do any of these things?
It has to be an anxiety, particularly if the legislation is underspecified. And, you know, I mean, the deputy convener made a wee joke about, you know, what about the current government? I mean, our experience since devolution has been that we have, with the four governments, the universities have had a very constructive engagement, and we have flourished in comparison to other European higher education systems, and we have flourished in comparison to the English one. But we have an anxiety that if a future government were given the apparatus whereby it could intervene in our management or government structures, that it might choose to do so. And again, if you look around Europe, you can find examples of countries where the government or the local or the regional governments do intervene in the governance of universities, and it is usually unhelpful.
Okay, Gerry.
I add to that, we currently do adhere to a code of good governance, and we utilise that fully within our organisations. And I think, as Seona quite rightly said earlier on, what the Scottish Code of Governance would do is contextualise that and ensure that the different circumstance that we find ourselves in Scotland is respected within the Code of Governance, and I think it's worth examining that. Beyond that, passing legislative powers that then restrict our capacity as organisations to reflect the diversity of mission that is of huge benefit to Scotland and to the Scottish economy, I think is a real risk to the sector. And as was said earlier, in other countries, they look to emulate what we have here in terms of the autonomy that exists, because they recognise the success of the higher education system in the UK and the United States, for example. And so, as Sir Tim has said, in terms looking at France and Germany and others, they're trying to give their universities more autonomy so that they can be as successful as we are. We would see it as a retrograde step to then begin to legislate to reduce, possibly reduce autonomy of universities.
I'm glad you mentioned the current code, which is obviously in existence and which you all, I'm sure, abide by. But what I'm struggling to understand is why there should be an issue about a new code, because as the debate that happened before we started taking the evidence amongst committee members themselves it bears witness to, is that the code is not in the bill. The code is separate from the bill. Of course, it's referred to in the bill, but the code itself is not on the face of the bill, will not be legislated in primary legislation as such in terms of the detail of the code. So I'm wondering what the difference that your anxiety is about the current code and what the new code. I mean, what's the difference between these two? What's your main problem with it?
Well, it's within the bill as specified at the moment. The unspecified code, a minister would have control over whether or not that was utilised, or might put in place some other aspect or some other code that they might wish to see. And so that's where our anxiety lies. Not that we would look on, reflect on and review what we currently do, because that's a constant process. So it's less to do with and obviously we haven't seen what this new Scottish Code of Governance might look like, and would be open and receptive to seeing what it says within that. Our concern is around legislation that would pass power to ministers to control that.
What opportunity have HEIs had to input to the development of the new code?
I think all HEIs have been visited or are in the process of being visited by the two people who have been, the consultants who have been appointed by the chairs of in Scotland, and I think student bodies and a wide range of other stakeholders are engaged in that process currently. They haven't, for example, yet visited University of Stirling. We're due for a visit, I think, within the next couple of weeks.
So everybody's being visited and asked for their opinion and input into the new code. That's correct.
By the end of the process, they will have been.
They will have been, yes. Before the code's published.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, Joan, you wanted in on this, did you?
Well, I actually wanted to ask about widening access.
Well, we'll come back. We'll come back to that. I'll have a final question then on the governance issue before we move on to that. Can you explain to me the difference, or have you got a difference in your levels of anxiety, if I put it that way, between the terms governance and the terms management as expressed in the bill? Gerry.
Well, governance is about setting the policy and strategy in the way that Sir Jim articulated earlier, and I think very eloquently. The management is about, and you hear this anecdote that the boat is steered through governance and it's rowed by management, and it's very much about that. It's about the operationalisation of the strategic plans and so on. So they're very different things, and I think it would not be in the interests of the institution to have interference in terms of the management.
Can I just quote you from the evidence from one of the bill team last week at column 1746 in the OR, where Tracy Slavin says the phraseology in the bill refers to governance and management. Discussion with the sector has indicated that the focus on strategic management may have some unintended consequences, and that has gone slightly wider than we anticipated. We are therefore happy to talk with the sector about the detail of that as we get to stage 2. I mean, it sounds from that response by that official that they're certainly reconsidering this position, and is that your understanding?
Yeah, I met with Tracy Slaven yesterday, and that was my exact understanding, yes.
And that's helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Very helpful.
That is helpful. Are there any more questions on governance before we move on to access? Neil?
Yeah, really just about the going through the some of the evidence that I have seen, particularly for University of Scotland, they keep referring to concern about more ministerial power in other areas. Can you maybe comment on some of the concerns that you have about this kind of centralisation?
I'll make an opening comment on that, and then my colleagues might want to respond. I mean, Scotland is as a higher education system, is very particular. Unlike England, we don't allow university title for institutions that don't award the PhD degree in Scotland. We have, obviously, the Open University in Scotland, who are a very important part of the offering in Scotland. We have 2 very successful art schools, and then we have the University of the Highlands and Islands, which is very particular, very appropriate for the northwest of Scotland, and not something for which there is any obvious model for in any other part. And I think our anxiety is that diversity, and obviously there are tremendous differences in scale. I mean, the University of Edinburgh is about 5 times the size of the average British university. Some of the other Scottish universities are a proportion of the size of the average British university. And that very diverse system is working very well. And therefore we would be anxious that some attempt, as it were, to systematise might inadvertently be unhelpful for so for example, the art schools with their very particular missions, or the UHI, or the big universities like Strathclyde, Glasgow and Edinburgh.
Neil, if I may, just to come back specific to the question about governance and concerns, I mean, reflecting not to be too historical, I mean, that the Western tradition of establishing institutions that were autonomous and free from the fear of input or direct steerage from government, from media, from other special interest groups, I think has to be a fundamental principle that we would say is absolutely the heart of what universities should be about, not only in Scotland but internationally. But on the governance and scrutiny piece in particular, and we recognise that this is a well-informed committee, but just to remind ourselves, as well as the independent lay members of court, and of course we have the Senate, that are the supreme group that look at academic autonomy. Over the years, the universities, I mean, my own, will go through scrutiny from the Scottish Funding Council, the Quality Assurance Agency Scotland, independent accountants, the Audit Committee of Court, bodies regulating our professions, be that in humanities, science, engineering and business, and indeed independent external advisors. And through all of that, I would contend that universities are perhaps one of the most scrutinised sectors in society. We must continue to be scrutinised, we must continue to be accountable, but I want to make sure that we understand, as well as the correct governance review that we're going through, the platforms for scrutiny, test, challenge and accountability is well built and has been there for historical reasons, but fundamentally for the universities, that independence of thought, that ability to challenge government, challenge society, challenge thinking, is something we need to protect very, very preciously.
Thank you. I want to move on now to, I know we've strayed into it slightly earlier, wedding access, but George Adam is going to start us on this.
Thank you, Convener. Morning, gentlemen. I just want to ask a similar question to ask the Build team last week. With regards to widening access, it's not just about access, it's about the retention, obviously, and how, because the challenges still remain after the initial years of getting into the actual institution. So I would like to ask about how you would deal with that with regards to retention. Also, another thing I'd like to ask about was the fact that there's various universities, I've already mentioned it today, who are very good at getting people from very different backgrounds. In my own constituency in Paisley, UWS are particularly good at it. Now, if we are giving extra funding to try and make sure that we get other people involved in education, higher education, then why are we not just putting all the money into institutions like UWS and just saying, you're good at it, you continue? Why are we almost awarding failure to a certain degree with some of the ancients who, not all, but some whose access isn't that great.
Just on that point.
Well, briefly, yes.
It's my understanding that there is no extra funding for widening access within the provisions of the bill. I don't know if that might just be helpful to the discussion.
I don't think that the notion of rewarding failure makes particularly good sense here. I mean, what we have, and we have it in terms of the recent bidding for access and other places, is we have mechanisms which the Scottish Funding Council introduces at the behest of the Scottish Government, which provide extra resource for the successful recruitment and retention of widening participation students. So there's no sense in which anybody is being rewarded for success, but there are funding mechanisms which do take into account and it's very appropriate that they exist. There are funding mechanisms that do take into account the widening participation students will, on average, require more money. They will require more resource prior to coming into the university. They will require more resource at the university to ensure that they are successful, and that is entirely appropriate. So I don't think there's any way, if you look at the current funding mechanisms for widening access, that one could suggest that failure is being rewarded. What there are is a set of arrangements which all the universities voluntarily agree with, whereby, to the extent that we improve our position in widening participation, the extra resource that is necessary, because there are three phases here. There is recruitment, there is preparation for study, and there is extra support during the study, which all require resource. So, and I think the mechanisms that the Scottish Funding Council currently have in place are appropriate, and the universities are successfully using those mechanisms to improve the positional access.
Could I just add? I think basically the principle upon which we should approach widening participation is that all students, whatever backgrounds they come from, should have the same choices as all other students, and so it's our responsibility as institutions, if we are challenged in that area, to make sure that we work hard to remove barriers, to, as I said before, to raise aspirations and to ensure that those choices are available.
You mentioned UWS, and we respect what Seamus and his colleagues have been doing there. It's an excellent success story. I mean, back to the diversity approach, if I may, George, in terms of the successes that each university will be able to present, and how the panel perceive them is another matter, but I think every university would have a very compelling story to tell how they've taken serious of that widening access. At Strathclyde, what we're looking at actively now is a very meaningful partnership with our own students. I mean, our own student president, who I think will be involved in evidence here shortly. The Students' Association innovated around a programme called Strathguides, which is bringing Strathclyde directly connected to universities' interest in those schools with low participation. And this is something that we, again, need to recognise. It's back to the point that was made earlier by Seona, that the diversity is something for us to celebrate, and the innovation that is generated at GSA, Edinburgh, Stirling, Strathclyde, is something we share. Through University Scotland, we have committee structures and engagement structures where if Gerry discovers a particular approach, then that's shared with us. But of course, the breadth of the activity we have in this approach through responsible autonomy allows us to say, does that work for us in our geography? Does that work for us in our particular societal and economic makeup in the region? And again, for Strathclyde, you heard Harry Burns talking about this very recently, about the challenge, the socio-economic challenge in and around Glasgow. That means that we have a particular opportunity to engage with the SIMD 20 and 40, because there are many young underprivileged, talented young people that we can elevate into the opportunity. But again, there's no homogeneity in Scotland. The socio-economic mix is different, the strategic approach by universities is different, but the innovation that comes through that diversity is something that we share, and I think, again, something that we can celebrate. And UWS has some very exemplary approaches, again, that we're aware of, and where we can try and take the best of that in the context of what we individually try to achieve as institutions.
Can I just ask, I'm probably going the other end of the scale now when I'm asking this question, is the other one that's a very media-led question is the fact of students who are high achievers possibly getting displaced by the chance of, with the possibility of us widening access. What would your answers be to that side? Because obviously it's a balancing mechanism.
Well, I mean, the fact of the matter is there are a limited number of places in universities, and if you work very hard on one constituency, then that will change the balance. I mean, the mediating fact is that the Scottish Government has provided additional places. For this coming year, there are 1,700 additional, and these are focused particularly on widening participation. So that obviously, to the extent, so that 1,700 extra will not result in any displacement. But inevitably, if you have got a limited resource and you change the mix, there will be,
There will be a competitive environment as
yes,
universities
it is a highly competitive environment.
The additional 1,700 places that Sir Tim has just alluded to are spread across all of the universities, and we've all agreed to take on additional students and put support mechanisms in place to ensure that those students are given every opportunity to succeed. If as that cohort moves through the system, we'll also be held to account for the success of retention of those students and successful completion. And we've managed to do all of that without legislation. What this bill would seek to do would be enshrine that in some way in legislation, and we don't know as we enter into this sort of process just exactly how the individual cohorts and the individual students going through the system will respond, and legislation in a sense provides a more of a straitjacket for us to operate within, and we would like the flexibility that currently exists to be responsive to the needs of the individual students and society in delivery.
If I could make one more comment. I mean, displacement is a charged notion. In practice, what happens, and has obviously happened the last 100 years, is that the pattern of students, the mix of students going into universities, has changed. The big displacement that has happened, if you look at the statistics, and it's a startlingly big displacement, is one I think most people would be comfortable with, which is that we've moved from a position where women were a small minority of university students to now where female students are a majority. Now that, you could regard that as being more appropriate and being gender fair, or you could use, if you wished, you could use the language of displacement and say that boys have been displaced or males have been displaced from university by women. But if you look at the statistics, you can see from, you look at it and look at the statistics from 45 and run them to now, well, the change has been really quite dramatic. And that's the big change that's happened.
Thank you. Joe McAlpine.
Yes, just to talk about some of the specific measures that you use or you could use to widen access. I just wondered what your view was on interviews. It always struck me as strange that universities in this country don't interview more and tend to rely on paper qualifications. If you look at some of the Ivy League American universities, MIT is the one I'm most familiar with, is they put a lot of resource into interviewing all the students so that they can judge their potential as opposed to just what's on paper, because obviously if you go to a very high achieving fee paying school you're more likely to have straight A's, whereas if you went to a school that was in more difficult circumstances you might not have quite such a fantastic set of results, but in terms of how you've performed against your peers and against the circumstances that you find yourself in, that can only come out in interview, the potential of that young person. So I just wondered why you don't interview more.
I'll offer a starting comment from the point of view mostly of Edinburgh, and then let other people come in. There are two reasons. One is if you look at the data from, in the UK system, from universities that do interview, like Oxford and Cambridge, it doesn't actually give one comfort that is a process that is going to really help you with the widening participation. So there is a certain amount of scepticism about a half-hour interview or a 20-minute interview. The other observation is if you look at the University of Edinburgh, if you take the applicants to Oxford and Cambridge together and then double it, that's about what we have. We have about 50,000 applicants. To interview 50,000, nearly all of whom, in terms of their paper qualifications, would be competent to come into the university. It would really not be feasible to run 50,000 interviews. My colleagues wouldn't be doing anything else. We'd have to stop teaching for a couple of months. So both in terms of the volume, but also in terms of the apparent reliability of the interview technique, where one is fairly sceptical.
I agree with what Tim has said, John. I mean, but however, there are examples of where this has been applied. I mean, again, anecdotally, but the evidence is there to, if you're interested. When I'm an ex-head of department in electronic and electrical engineering, and every applicant that indicated that electrical at Strathclyde was one of their choices was interviewed, and it was a big overhead, but it did give us some insight into that broader mix and indeed some of the depth. But Tim is absolutely right. The care that had to be played out in that process meant, in order to be fair to all of these individuals, there was quite a diverse interview team, and as a consequence, one had to take enormous care to make sure that you didn't introduce any accidental disadvantages en route. But nonetheless, it can be appropriate. Another example in our outcome agreements, and this is an example of us innovating, and we've not mentioned this, Convener, but it's the role and prospect of how we play as a sector value into the economic growth in Scotland. In Strathclyde, we're about to launch the Engineering Academy in direct response to a stated requirement from business and industry, particularly around the Glasgow area. So it's Babcock, BE Systems, Scottish Power, Scottish and Southern. And in many ways, we're going to have a 2-year interview with the youngsters that are going to come through the college sector. So again, well, we have to be subtle and also quite innovative in understanding how do we pre-select, how do we engage with our partners, and indeed I think all of the universities at the table here today, and I would dare say most of them in the sector, have very meaningful partners with their colleges in the college sector. And although we have the new regional restructuring in and around Glasgow, that will mean 4 groups of what were 3 previous colleges. And at steady state, these 400 kids will be paired and pre-qualified, as it were, in the process through colleges. But they will also have been interviewed, but more importantly, supported and developed by the industry partners that get alongside us and our college partners. So again, John, I would say that there's a mixed approach that needs to be applied, and we need to be subtle and apply different techniques as and when they're appropriate.
And Joan, if we take the intention behind your idea of interviewing, and characterise it as direct engagement with widening participation students, then certainly that's what we should do. If you look at, again, our very successful Lothian Equal Access, that was 1,200 potential university students that we directly engaged with. And some part of that might be something like an interview in terms of encouraging them to raise their aspirations, but it's not, the big queue of students and here's your 15-minute interview. I think it's, to take the spirit of your question, I think what the key is for us to directly engage with potential widening participation students, but not to attempt to interview the entire set of applicants for the sector.
Because we're tiny, we do interview, and we do consider portfolios and not just academic qualifications. But interestingly, the interview is the most contentious part of the process in terms of research. The jury really being out as to whether interviews are a fair means of selecting candidates, because there is some evidence that they're not. That actually interviews can be discriminatory as well as supportive. So I think there's no single approach to admissions that support widening participation. Although I would say, and my colleague to my right hasn't mentioned it, but Edinburgh has a very, very effective system of contextualised admissions, whereby I think you score differently in terms of applicants coming from particular postcodes or particular backgrounds in order to acknowledge that academic achievement may be less well developed in some schools and in some areas than in others.
Admissions is a particularly complex area and exactly the sort of thing that we would see responsible autonomy of the institutions having control over, rather than having something done onto us in terms of admissions. It might be, for example, a portfolio of artwork, it might be proficiency in music, it might be grades on an exam, it could be a very wide range, and they're professionals who have spent many years assessing the capacity of a student. When we admit a student, it's not just about getting over a hurdle to get into and onto a course. It's about assessing the competency of the individual to complete the course, and so we're not setting people up for failure, and that's a complex process, and we try to execute it as fairly as is possible.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I move on now to section 4 of the bill on the tuition fees cap, and Neil Bibby will start us off.
Thanks. I know a number of you have suggested your, I think it was University of Scotland, but also maybe the University of Stirling submission has said they're broadly content with this section of the bill, but it was just to ask briefly, do you support the intentions to have the cap of fees for our UK students, and why is that?
It seems, I mean, the bill, what's in the bill is in the spirit of the voluntary agreement, which I, as acting convener of University of Scotland, negotiated with the Cabinet Secretary. That voluntary agreement, which is capping us on a year-by-year basis compared to England, Wales and Northern Ireland, has met the desired intention, which is that we wanted there to be no dramatic swings in terms of patterns of numbers. We wanted there to be no dramatic reduction in the rest of the UK students, and we wanted there to be no dramatic increase. And so our view is that is, if I can almost express it this way, I mean, it's a very, very strong success. If you look at the data for the past entry into 2012, and now we've just got completed, now that we've hit the UCAS deadline of the 15th, so we look at the likely entry in 2013, you know, the Scottish Government had a policy objective which the university supported, and the fee regime that was put into place has exactly met it. And so we would be very content with continuing on the exact basis that we are.
Can I ask, in addition to that, do your universities receive more money from giving degrees to rest of UK students than you receive from giving degrees to Scottish and European students?
Well, you have to account for the whole thing. You have to, in our case, if I'm very particular with regard to Edinburgh, we, partly I suppose because we were very committed to widening participation, and partly we were concerned about the possible flows, is we committed ourselves to the best bursaries in the United Kingdom. So, as I mentioned earlier, 1,000 of our intake came in with bursaries. The highest that we have from Edinburgh would have a student supported over the 4 years to the tune of £33,000, and that is an uncapped scheme. We've also within Edinburgh committed many millions to a new personal tutor system to support. So overall, you know, the financial position is neutral. Overall, in terms of patterns of students from different parts of the United Kingdom coming to Scotland, the policy objective that the government had has met, and the universities are in the appropriate place.
So, so in terms of the amount of money that you receive from English students studying at Scottish universities, is that more than what you receive from Scottish students and European students?
It is a bit more, but we also, as I was indicating, we have been investing very heavily in bursaries, and we are now again, if I look at it from the point of view of Edinburgh, we are now dramatically improving our position with regard to bursaries for Scottish domiciled students.
Okay. You say it's a bit more in terms of funding you get from English students. Would I be right in saying that your university and a number of other universities are marketing themselves to English students to come and study in Scotland?
The position that we have, I mean, I can speak for Edinburgh University on this one. I can't speak for the other universities, but so I'll let my colleagues. The position at Edinburgh is we wish to maintain the current balance of Scottish EU and our UK students, and we have been broadly successful in achieving that.
Obviously, there is a concern if the Scottish Government is wanting to widen access. There is an increase in the number of English students coming to to Scottish universities, there's no additional money, as I understand it, for widening access. So there's not going to be a huge number of increase in the overall number of places. That displacement issue doesn't just, we're not just talking about a potential impact in terms of widening access, but also the impact that a potential increase in the number of rest of the UK students would have as a potential improvement in your financial state.
Yeah, if you take the situation in the University of Stirling last year as an example, we had 212 the funding for 212 rest of UK students taken from us by the Scottish Funding Council, and our expectation was that by charging fees to those students from the rest of the UK, we would replace the resource associated with those 212. We recruited 180 rest of UK students into Stirling, so that leaves us with a deficit in terms of the overall sums of money. In terms of additional places, I think as we've said earlier in the discussion, there are additional places that have been provided this year, some 1,700 spread across all of the universities in Scotland to admit students from SIMD Fforde groups. So, and I can imagine that the money that was withdrawn from the rest of UK students in some way enhanced the coffers that allowed that process to take place.
I mean, I would say the key thing would be to look at the statistics for the Scottish higher education system in 2012 and compare them with 2011. And the position is broadly neutral, but with a very modest increase in students from the rest of the UK, a very modest increase in students from Scotland and the European Union. And, as you know, we have heard the First Minister contrast the positive position in Scotland with the position in England, but the position in Scotland is available. All you need to do is look at the statistics, and the statistics will show there has been a small positive change with regard to numbers, and there's been a larger change with regard to success in widening participation. But those statistics are readily available.
Yeah, I agree. We certainly do need to keep an eye on the statistics and see how that progresses. Can I just ask, that there was a point that was made in one of the submissions about Welsh students and the charging for Welsh students, and how that was unclear in the bill. What currently do you charge, or what is the current set up for Welsh students, and have you got any further comments on that?
The rest of UK students are just treated like an English or an English student or a student from Northern Ireland. They're very small numbers of Welsh students, I believe, come to Scotland actually at all, but they're in funding terms, and they're treated exactly the same as students from England or Northern Ireland.
So they're treated, I mean, to elaborate slightly, students from England, Wales, Northern Ireland are treated in Scotland so that they all, from the point of view of the personal demand on their finances, end up in exactly the same position. And the concern with the drafting of the bill was that inadvertently the Welsh students would not be treated because the drafting wasn't quite right. That they inadvertently, the Welsh, well, it clearly wasn't the bill's intention, but the drafting was such that inadvertently the Welsh students might not have been treated on a par with the English and Northern Ireland ones. But the point is well understood by the drafters of the bill, and it will be fixed.
Okay. Can I move on now to the review of fundable further and higher education, section 14 of the bill, and Claire Adamson.
Thank you. The policy memorandum for the bill explains that it wants to allow the Scottish Funding Council to review the provision of fundable further and higher education with a view to ensuring that the education is being provided by post-16 education bodies in a coherent manner. And it goes on to talk, and you've talked a lot about autonomy today, but it goes on to talk about duplication of effort and regional pressures and competition. And I was just wondering if we could have your views on this.
Yes, perhaps I can comment initially. As things stand, the education provision is demand-led. Students choose the universities that they'd like to go to. We respond to that. Courses are put on in response to it or ended because they're no longer required. If we flip that over and go to a supply-led model where there is a sort of a framework within which it's decided what courses will be offered and in what regions, and then students choose not to turn up, I think that would be hugely disadvantageous for the sector. So we would suggest that the demand-led model that currently exists is practical and fit for purpose.
And I really want to reinforce what Gerry said. Again, if you look at the statistics of UK universities in the post-war period, you will see that where there have been government interventions, in an attempt, as it were, to predict demand, they have very often been unsuccessful. The simple position is to trust the students, to assume that then they suddenly, in larger numbers, decide to go into computing courses, psychology courses or computing courses or creative arts courses, that they are being rational, and for the universities as autonomous institutions to, as quickly as possible, respond to the demand. And again, if you look at university systems around the world, the ones that are demand-led are much more successful in having appropriate tertiary education for their students than the ones where government departments in different countries attempt to predict the future needs of the economy in any sort of precise way and then instruct the universities as to how many places there should be in this or that subject.
Just to build on that, if I may, with which I agree, I should say, of course, the student's voice and the quality of what's been provided and the selectivity and the experience of the students in these programmes are increasingly important. Very obvious national programme through the National Student Survey will indicate how the students have been taught, their perception of what they've received, the quality of the spend in educational, pedagogical materials, be that the library, be it other support activities, and of course employability and employment at the end of the programme is important there. So the performance, as it were, of programmes, this is not a closed system. Students make value judgments, they make careers choices, they'll also look at the specialisms of the universities, which are quite different. And it's back to this diversity of provision, but of course, importantly, and I think correctly, and more of which I'm sure you'll hear shortly, I think the student voice in that quality of provision and the student experience itself is becoming all the more important, and that's correct, and I think we welcome that.
Worth saying also that universities don't exist in a bubble. I mean, they're engaged with a very, very wide range of stakeholders, and they can also anticipate trends within society. They can identify areas where new programs and new areas of demand will be opening up, and so. That's the appropriate way of being able to identify the shape of higher education, both in terms of the stakeholders that depend on it and in terms of the student applications who will also benefit from it.
Okay, Liz Smith.
Can I just ask a very quick question on this section of the bill, which is a response to what you just said about the demand-led, and that varies obviously between HE and FE. Not least because FE, I think, is getting something like 75% of its funding, obviously very much in the public, but it's actually a diminishing level for HE that's coming from public funds as a percentage share. Would you argue that this section of the bill might be better slightly separated out so that HE is dealt slightly differently from FE?
I mean, I think we'd be reluctant to pontificate on what's appropriate for the colleges. I think we're very clear that as far as the universities are concerned, student demand is the fundamental. Student choice, student demand, and to have autonomous institutions which can quickly respond to the student demand, and we've seen, and student demand varies. Again, if you look at the pattern of demand over the last 50 years, it varies quite dramatically. We have very sensibly now a great demand in the creative arts. We have in my own area, computer science, very strong demand, which 30 years ago was hardly there at all, and it is so. I don't think we would feel able to say how it should be for the colleges, but we would be very clear that the universities should be able to directly engage with the student voice in terms of the pattern of provision that we provide.
Okay, thank you. Next question comes from Colin Beattie on college regionalisation.
Thank you, Vera. Professor Prudzinski's review of higher education governance stated that Scottish universities should include engaging proactively with further higher education institutions and any new governance structures that came in place, obviously regionalisation of colleges and so on. To what extent has that been happening already, or is it being planned to happen?
There's an awful lot of activity, and I mean, again, speaking for Edinburgh, we particularly engage with what were the separate Edinburgh colleges, which are now, but the University of Edinburgh is engaged in terms of articulation and in terms of planning routes. I would be very confident that all the Scottish universities are engaged with colleges. It might not, and not always local ones. I mean, in case of the University of Edinburgh, we're a long-standing supporter and partner of the UHI, and we're a sponsor and supporter of the UHI before it achieved university status, and that is obviously a larger distance. But I myself served on the academic board of the UHI, and we have a very close and productive relationship with Seona Ostig in terms of Scottish studies and Celtic studies.
If I may comment, I think it's a good question. I think an excellent example of how the sector, HE and FE, have self-organised in the past 2 years very effectively, acknowledging their own responsible autonomy responsibilities. To that, Stuart, if I may, I have the privilege of chairing two of Scotland's research pools, one in engineering and one in energy, and that's a partnership across all of the universities. But to the college articulation, but 2 years ago there was a very clear and present demand statement from the energy industry. Oil and gas, offshore renewables, grid. We need to invest in Scotland over the next 10 years somewhere around £50 billion of infrastructure, which is going to be critically dependent on the high quality and high-end skills from universities, PhDs, Masters, Bachelor of Science, the research outputs that flow from the pools, which are conjoined in the partnerships that have been mentioned to you, but critically importantly in the skills agenda, a very large number of modern apprenticeships are going to be required, higher national qualifications, and as a consequence, and stimulated by the Scottish Funding Council in partnership with the Energy Technology Partnership that I chair, the college is self-organised into what they call the College Energy Skills Partnership. That's across Scotland, addressing a national opportunity for a global market, and as a result we have potential for pull-through now of thousands of new modern apprenticeship jobs that will come through the colleges. Many of these young men and women that will start their lives in the colleges will find themselves in industry, but there will be a significant proportion of them that will then flow through into the university. Some of them are represented today, to then be pursuing a higher order degree with a very good chance of employment at the end of it. So all of that came not from a national driven agenda, it came from an opportunity of SFC, Scottish Enterprise, Highlands and Islands, and indeed the universities and colleges working together very effectively. And I think it's an absolute exemplar of how that self-organising approach to opportunity has led to an excellent result.
Would you say that on the back of that there's been elimination of duplication perhaps between the different institutions?
The word I would use is there's been greater coordination and complementarity. Now, duplication is, one cannot judge by the level of a programme what might be inside that detail. So, for example, in electrical engineering in Institution X as opposed to Institution Y, the specialisations could be quite different. The degree that may be producible might say a BSc or an HND in electrical engineering, but the experience and the relevance of that individual's education and ultimate experience could be different. So again, I think what I am telling you about is more about coordination and partnership, and I think the sector, HE and FE, are showing they can work effectively together. And again, I would say, because the international opinion would support it, that pooling, for example, is an absolute international exemplar of how universities work together to complement each other. And again, not to make it an energy lecture, but between Edinburgh and Strathclyde, Tim and I strategically meet on a regular basis with our research leaders to make sure that what we are pursuing and what we do complement each other, and that then flows out to our colleagues in Aberdeen and Heriot Watt. So when we present the Scottish higher education scene on the international front, then we're presenting a very coherent activity. So we have universities coming here from around the world, we have funding councils coming here from around the world, because they recognise that what we're doing together with this autonomous, responsible approach to concentrating on our separate missions, but working together to present a much bigger value.
Interpreting from what you're saying that you've been pursuing the opportunity for shared services, shared resources within the group?
Yes, without getting into too much detail, Colin, because of commercial and confidence, Strathclyde and Aberdeen are in the process just now of making a very significant joint investment in ERM systems for the operations of our universities.
I think if you look at the question, and I think Colin's made a very good question about shared services, then the universities have a really strong leadership position. We have, in terms of joint procurement, got a very robust jointly owned operation where we do much better than any other group of organisations in the public sector or in the quasi-public sector. If you look at, I chair the Joint Information Systems Committee. If you look at the networking in universities, that is entirely run as a shared service. If you look at a higher education digital library in Scotland, Sheddle, we share a lot of electronic journals, which reduces cost and improves access. And it is a very important area for us, in which I think the universities are conspicuously successful in putting together shared services.
The college restructuring changes the whole game plan throughout Scotland. Yeah. What are the implications for universities of that regionalisation, both positive and negative?
I think a simple positive would be that it makes it easier. There are as it were, a smaller number of points of contact with larger colleges. So in terms of the environment in Edinburgh, now I relate directly to Mandy, who heads the new Edinburgh College. Before, it was slightly more work to relate to the 3 colleges that were immediately nearby, and then the 3 other colleges that were a bit further away. So it certainly makes it a little bit easier for us, and the relations are very good. And I mean, I was mentioning Lothian Equal Access and the 1,200 who through that have gone into universities. Almost 500 who went into Lothian Equal Access actually went into colleges. And about 100 coming out of colleges came into the University of Edinburgh. And obviously with fewer points of contact, and with it's going to be, I think, easier for the universities to manage their relationship with the college sector.
If I may, the immediate challenge is just the transitional phase we're in just now, Colin. So we are supportive of and are very appreciative of what the colleges are doing and what they're going through. Another example of coordination and partnership that I'll mention, and I talked earlier about the Engineering Academy that will be launched this year. What was a very interesting natural evolution that through the early part of the year, the college groupings that are working with Strathclyde alongside us, we actually coordinated our outcome agreements, which I think was a very good indication about the strategic alignment where leadership had shown with the university, but in order to have the colleges work most effectively, they decided, they weren't guided by us, they decided to align their outcome agreements. They gave a much more coherent and credible proposition to the Funding Council to make that investment. But the biggest challenge just now is the transition phase that they're going through, and clearly that will take, I don't think too long, but maybe the next year before it starts to settle down into the new mode of operation.
If you talk to, I think, any of the universities in Scotland, you would find that those relationships with colleges is very strong. Stirling, for example, works very closely with Forth Valley College, and we have a number of programmes. Just to go back to the demand-led point, those programmes are created in response to student needs, and we work very closely to ensure that the needs of both the individual students, because they're seeking skill sets and education that can lead them to employment, and we engage with the business sector and look at their predictive needs of skill sets and the sorts of workforce that they would need, and then are responsive to that. So the integration of the universities and the colleges and the connections through to industry across the sector is very strong. And again, that's done proactively by the institutions on the ground without the need for any legislative requirement to force us to do that.
I was going to move on to the next section, which was section 15 of the bill on data sharing, but I noticed, Gerry, from the University of Stirling's evidence, you've said we understand that this provision is not intended to apply to universities.
Is this the students' one, or is that our actual one?
This is your one, I think.
Is it?
University of Stirling.
Okay, yeah.
And it says on about section 15, it says, we understand that this provision is not intended to apply to universities. Now, in the actual bill, I can see nothing about that. Have you got...
In discussion with the Scottish Government, we understand that this section is not intended to create new duties on higher education institutions, since existing data collection and sharing is assumed to be adequate. Yes.
So that's from the University of Scotland submission.
No, this is from the University of Stirling. I'm reading, but there may well be other ones as well.
It's a duplication of what I think was said in the University
I'm
of Scotland
just trying to clarify, because there's nothing in the bill that says it doesn't apply. And then the policy memorandum says, when a provider of learning or training enrolls a young person, they will share a record with SDS of that young person's enrolment along with other agreed fields. That's at 45 within the policy memorandum. Where does that understanding come from that it doesn't apply to universities?
I couldn't answer that question at this point in time. I don't know if any of my colleagues or any of the University of Scotland. Alistair, would you like to? Is that permissible?
No, you're not, Alistair. So, so we'll stop there.
We'll get you that information.
I'm sure the information can be provided to us after the meeting. So, if that's the case, then we'll just finish there, and we won't ask you any questions in data sharing if it doesn't actually apply to you. Can I thank you very much for attending this morning? We've been slightly rushed, but I do appreciate you taking the time to be with us this morning. Thank you.
And Convener, can we, through you, thank the Education and Culture Committee for a very interesting and thoughtful set of questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'll suspend briefly. Thank you. Can I reconvene members, and can I welcome to the committee our final panel this morning. We have Christina Andrews, Vice President, Education and Engagement, University of Stirling Students' Union, Freddie Fforde, Association President, University of St Andrews Students' Association, Malcolm Moore, President, University of Strathclyde Students' Association, and Gerry Quigley, President, University of West of Scotland Students' Association. First of all, can I apologise for keeping you waiting? I know we're slightly later than intended. And given that you've sat through all the evidence, and you'll have heard what the principals had to say, hopefully you can refer to that if you agree with previous evidence that's been given, and move quickly on to areas where there's any disagreement or additional information you would like to provide to the committee. But can I begin this session, as we did before, with Liz Smith on university governance?
Thank you, Convener. I wonder if I could ask you just to comment on the intentions in the bill, obviously, to legislate on the question of both governance and management.
Well, we put in our submission from Strathclyde that we welcome, in the main, really, to legislate in our written submissions. I believe the principals said that they didn't feel that it was necessary to legislate, but at Strathclyde anyway, we're in the main we're in favour of it.
Could you tell us why?
Why?
Yes.
Beyond the fact that it helps the students' associations to lobby the universities, really because it's something so that will ensure that it's sustainable in the future. And that
Could you give us some idea of, obviously, in academic and educational terms or economic, social terms, why legislating on a code of governance would help the university and therefore obviously be very much in tune with students' needs?
I'm put on the spot now. Can you repeat the question, sorry?
Yes, I'm just asking, obviously, if we are to legislate on the governance question, I think we've got an overall agreement in all the submissions I've seen, whether they come from students or members of staff or principals, chairs, etc. The overall ambition is to improve and sustain, obviously, the educational achievements of Scottish universities, which are very significant, and also to enhance their economic and social achievement and diversity. Could you explain why you think a code of governance in legislation would help that process?
Yeah.
I think it shows good practice across the sector. We've met with the consultant who's working for University of Scotland in terms of the things that we like in terms of the From Principle report. For example, making sure that the chair of COTE is as independent from the senior management team as possible to make sure that the student president is involved in the selection of the principal. And in terms of the role of the rector, there is disagreement among student bodies in terms of do we think that's the best way to ensure the views of students are best heard on University Court. In terms of the submissions made by the university principals in terms of governance and management, we don't think there's anything in the actual bill that would infringe upon the management of a university. For example, in terms of access agreements, they're very much fitted around the local context of a university and ultimately have to be signed off by the University Court. At UWS, for example, our outcome access agreements very much fit the local context and the need to address retention. So, in terms to answer your question, is to ensure good practice across the sector to make sure that governance, good governance, has been shared across all universities in Scotland.
Would you disagree then with the principals who we heard this morning, who saying that they would like to see the management that removed from the bill? Would you like to see it in the bill?
Again, back to my point, I don't know if there's anything in the actual bill that infringes upon management. So we would possibly agree with, on that point, but the point is that some of the projects have been outlined in the report, for example, access agreements, very much are decided upon by the institutions and not by the Scottish Government or the Scottish ministers.
I think the point that was put to us, obviously, from the Bill team last week, and obviously the submissions that I've read so far, is that there is a bit of an issue about management involving the sort of day-to-day running of some of the universities' procedures on management, and also if that was taken to fuller extent that it would start to impinge on the academic freedom of the institution. Would you be quite happy with that process if that was the case?
We would support academic freedom, and
you would support academic freedom. Okay, thank you very much.
May I respond?
Yep.
Is that on? Right. I think in general, echoing sentiments to my left regarding the von Dinsky report, I think it's really helpful that this has come around, because I think in lots of the individual universities, different customs have grown up, some of which are appropriate, some of which aren't. And I'll leave that to the evidence that we gave last week to Dr. West, who was collecting our thoughts on the matter. But on this issue specifically, I wanted to ask for a bit of clarification. I'm not all that experienced in this area, so forgive me if I'm asking you to go over old ground. But the wording that I have a question over is 9A, that Scottish ministers may, when making a payment to a higher education institution under section 12.1, require the institution to comply with any principles of governance or management which appear to the Scottish ministers to constitute good practice in relation to higher education. My reading of that is that it's a little vague. Any principles which appear to the Scottish ministers. Could you elaborate for me how that might work, who these ministers might be? Is it...
Well, that's something that, you know, we ask the questions and you answer them. That's just
okay,
for clarity's sake.
It's a good question for the ministers.
Yeah, but it's the Scottish ministers.
That's what I'm uncomfortable with.
In terms of the government. Right. Well, let's explore that a little bit then. Sorry, I interrupted.
Yes, I mean, it is a very good question, and we will put that to the ministers when the Cabinet Secretary comes to give his evidence. What you've said there actually ties in with what Gary Quigley has just said too, that there would be an issue for some people, and you've just said that you're in favour of the academic freedom. There would be an issue if some of that power was taken too far. And I just wonder, at what stage do you think power has gone too far, or what you're very comfortable with?
I just find the wording ambiguous as it stands, without asking any further questions.
Right, thanks, Convener.
Joan McAlpine, you have any questions?
Yeah, well, I would be interested to know what the other two representatives thought about whether they felt that the wording was ambiguous as well.
Yeah, well, our thoughts are the wording, sort of, because the word may is there, makes it almost seem optional, and we prefer to have it as a requirement. So to substitute that with must, to make it more concrete.
I don't have anything to say on it.
Okay, moving on now to the issue of widening access in section 3 of the bill, and can I ask George Adam to kick us off?
Yes, I've heard everything that was stated by the principals earlier on, and I know for a fact that Gary's continually, as his local MSP, having a go at myself to make sure that we widen access, and it's a big thing with NUS nationally as well, to make sure that we widen access and make sure the UWS is quite good, because the figures here are 20% of the 20% of the most deprived data zones the UWS manages to do. But from what we've seen, a lot of the ancient universities don't seem to be as good at recruiting from opening up access to everywhere else. So what would be your thoughts in the way forward with regards to widening access in the universities?
I'll tell you, we are doing it UWS. George, you're right in saying that we have got a very good record when it comes to widening access. Just under 25% of the students that come to UWS are from the SIMD 20 background. But it's in our view that we can't be the only ones or one of the few who do that, and we think that more and more universities have to do that to make sure opportunities are available to all. Things that we do at UWS, we've got a strong engagement with the South West Articulation Hub. So, for example, a lot of students articulate into Fforde 4th year. Even though we're a regional university, we're still very much rooted in our local communities of Aird, Dumfries, Hamilton and Paisley. Again, we've got a high level of part-time students. Again, many of those students come from the most impoverished backgrounds. And it's fair to say that we've got a very good, the university has a very good relationship with us, the Student Association, and we do various activities that help widen access to students in the local area. Where we fall down is on the issue of retention. Even though we've got good access records, our retention levels are very poor. I refuse the point that because you widen access, you're going to have high levels of dropout rates. For example, GCU is a good example of an institution that widens access, but they've got good records of retention. So again, what we would say in terms of what if all universities are going to widen access, then I think everyone acknowledges that there has to be the right level of support to make sure that those students are retained. It's something that ourselves have been calling for the past 2 years. We feel that there has to be a national research project undertaken, looking into the student experience in Scotland and asking the questions of why do students drop out. That would hopefully give us answers and give us the solutions to be able to combat retention rates overall. But I'll let the other folks discuss the various projects that they're working on to widen access.
Yep, so Strathclyde, we're reasonably good with our widening access, around about 13% of SIMD 20 admissions. And when we welcome the additional places funded this year in regards to some of the ancients. Main one would be St Andrews that was in the news. With additional 20 places funded this year, that would actually be percentage-wise quite an increase. And just to echo what Professor Sir Jim McDonald was saying earlier, there is progress being made. We have to start somewhere when figures are released, but the key is to ensure that progress continues for years to come. So we're working at Strathclyde with the university on a major project, and we're also running one ourselves that the principal mentioned, Strathguides, where we're engaging with local schools that have low low percentages for entry to higher education institutions, and just to encourage students to think about education beyond high school and teaching sort of survival skills for university, where they can learn budgeting and things along lecture note taking, just to see that this is possible, and they could easily go on to it if they wished. So we're looking at that, but we're hoping that the Strathclyde, the spaces, so we received 40 additional spaces for widening access. We're hoping that they'll be the majority of those will be from SIMD 20, not just SIMD 40. So because Glasgow, obviously, we're situated quite well for that.
I think for all of us at the moment, widening access is very important, and institutions are starting to make headway in moving forward and progressing. But it's always that thing where progress tends to come slightly slow, and from Students' Unions Association's point of view, we want to speed that up a little bit more. The University of Stirling tends to sit in the middle ground between the amount of people that we get in from SMD 20, but our retention is also in the middle ground. And I think it's important to have a balance between the two, because as we've seen from different statistics, that UWS and GCU both have quite a high access, but for retention the numbers start to differ, whereas for Edinburgh and St Andrews the numbers are very similar for access, but again the retention is different. Edinburgh has a slightly higher retention than St Andrews, and I think when everyone's looking at widening access, they also need to think what support is available and making sure that institutions are appropriately supported to be able to cope with
that. You've just finished it on exactly what I wanted to talk about, so thank you. Elephant in the room, clearly I represent the institution which has by far the worst record, and we're all aware of that. They've got to do more, but if there's one thing that I want the committee to walk away with today, and for me the reason I'm really here, it's to emphasise just how different each institution is. And we've already talked about all the different programmes that are taken by different universities, but whilst St Andrews has got to do a lot more, it needs support, because we don't have an urban area to draw upon. I'm not surprised that we have low SIMD numbers, and I'm not surprised that widening participation is a challenge for St Andrews because we're in the middle of nowhere. And to the north in Dundee, there are 2 universities. To the west, when you reach Edinburgh, there's another 2 or 3 universities at least. And of course, trying to get students over from Glasgow is a big challenge. So what I really want to come out of this from my perspective, I'm sorry for indulging on such a personal experience, is that if universities, and particularly from my experience of St Andrews, isn't provided with the right kind of support to implement its widening participation programmes, and I refer specifically to the outreach work that we do, the summer schools, and I know that the proportion of money spent on that is really not very big at all in comparison to where we put other resources. And I would urge that in taking each institution on its own merits and its own challenges, that funding agreements reflect those specific challenges of those specific institutions. And so the suggestion that I give you is that funding is perhaps contingent on what works for each university. So outreach programs, outreach schools. I mean, we have to go out a long way to reach these potential students. More money invested in that kind of area, evidence based on what works, would be much more helpful than. You know, I rather feel that, and I feel embarrassed for my students that we get kicked the whole time. And I have students coming to me who complain that, you know, they feel that they are being positioned in the media as the wrong kind of people, and if you're a St Andrews student, then you don't care about people who aren't from the same background as you, which is just not the case. And defending my constituency, I find that an enormously difficult challenge. And I just think some more understanding of the particular challenges that we face, and again, sorry for the personal experience, is really needed, rather than a sort of general blanket.
To be fair to Freddie, when I have asked the question, I have said it's been media-led, the St Andrews side, because it's an easy one to take the figure and go there. And, but one of the things that the principals brought up was the fact that they would have got there without legislation, they believed, or that was the tone or the ideal that they said, you know, that they were getting there slowly but surely. Now, I believe personally, if you look at some of the figures, possibly that's the need for the legislation to try and widen access. Would you agree with that, or would you say...
I wouldn't agree with that. I think the NUS report states that we'd be waiting 40 and 50 years to have records that we could be proud of. So, no, I don't agree with the views of the principals.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Neil Finlay. I mean, I don't think any reasonable person is having a go at individual students at St Andrews. I think we're possibly having a go at the defences that are put up often by the institution as reasons or excuses as to why the progress is not being made. And forgive me for being critical somewhat, but it appears in some ways that you might be buying into that and saying, oh, St Andrews is in the middle of nowhere. Well, it's not exactly too far from Dundee, it's not exactly too far from Kirkcaldy and Fife. So, you know, I think we need to be a bit wary of yet another excuse being trotted out by St Andrews, and forgive me for being critical of you for that. But I'm more interested in Stirling submission said that the outcome agreements, process for developing outcome agreements did not adequately involve students and have led to outcome agreements with no student input. Would people across the board say that that's a general feeling?
Well, given it came from...
Yeah, do you want me to...
Yes, please, Christina.
Yeah. Part of the reason why I've wrote that is the fact that, as you all know, sabbatical teams tend to change year on year. And last year, the President and Vice President agreed at Academic Council, and then it went to court, that when it came to outcome agreements, the principal would decide how that was done in the principal's strategic group, which very few members are on. And I think that it's quite okay to, well, it's not okay for people to say, well, our students are on court and they've ticked this off, so it's absolutely fine. But I think although the University of Stirling is trying to get more students in from SMD 20, it's not enough, and I think they should be more ambitious.
Well, I mean, all outcome agreements to get signed off at court, and we've got 2 student representatives on that. However, at that stage, you know, having input into outcome agreements is you've not got much of a chance, so to speak. So even though everything that's in UWS's agreements is broadly what we agree and what we support, we do think there should be much greater space to involve students in this process, being a very important stakeholder in the university.
I agree entirely with what's been said. I think more input from students' associations would be completely welcomed. How you'd actually do that is where it becomes a bit complex, because the nature of the document is quite difficult. We would sit down, for example, we wrote a letter to the principal from myself and my predecessor, who, as Christina was saying, you change almost year in, year out. So we wrote a joint letter where we had what we were looking for and hoping for in the outcome agreements. But then input beyond that is quite difficult. We'll sit down in various meetings, education strategy and such, and then also two representatives on courts. We do sign it off, but actually to sit down and help or to have input on the drafting, I don't know how it would be done, but it would be welcome to have more input.
Just register a nod on my head. Yeah, we need more input into it.
Okay, no,
Liz Smith.
I just ask, all four principals said to us quite clearly this morning that SAMD is important, but it's not by any means the most accurate, just to take it on its own. And they all gave examples, and I think, if my memory serves me correct, Seona Reid was saying that in the last 6 years there has been a 16.9% improvement, and obviously Principal of Edinburgh gave quite a long scenario of how Edinburgh has improved, and so did Stirling and Strathclyde. Would you accept that these are important criteria that can be worked on to benefit people from different backgrounds, and that perhaps they could be actually more successful than just looking at the SAMD analysis?
I think we would welcome moves to possibly get a much more truer description of where students are coming from. If I was to be honest, I think that response was another sign that principals don't want to make improvements when it comes to widening access. You know, I think we've been talking about this for too long, that we can't delay any more progress in terms of finding out or getting a true picture of the true picture of our student profile.
So do you actually dispute what these figures?
I do think there's flaws in terms of looking at postcodes, but I do think it's the only way that most bodies, it's the only system that most bodies seem to use at this stage.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Can I move on to the issue of the fees cap now, and Neil Bibby?
Can I just ask you your position on the provision in the bill to put a cap on our UK fees, and what you believe that cap should be?
Probably state that one of the reasons that I don't know my colleagues that left too well is that they are members of the NUS and I'm not. So that clarification may just be worth overall that you know, if they're representing NUS views, that I'm not. As I understand it, there's a proposal to make the cost of a Scottish degree the same as it would be south of border, i.e. 4 years for the price of 3. I haven't misunderstood that. No. Okay. I think that's absolutely the right thing. I don't think there should be a difference for all the reasons that have been laid out there. But my only concern is that if I'm, again, coming back to my priorities, I need I'm going to find out on Friday if our union's going to be rebuilt in a huge project. We need a new sports centre. All our accommodation is falling to bits. My only concern is, without extra support from the government, we're talking about a huge funding gap. For the price of 3 sort of thing. How many millions that is, and how is that going to impact on other, if you will, frontline student services, the sorts of things I've just mentioned. So whilst I absolutely agree with the principle of the fees being no higher in Scotland than they can be south of the border, I worry about the implication, or rather, should I say, I'd want to know what else is done to make up for the loss in revenue for the universities, and again, how that's going to impact on services that my students would expect.
Has anyone else got?
Yes. So just to say that we're here to representing our students' associations, unions, and and such. Not obviously the views of NUS at the moment. So what we'd say from Strathclyde is that we welcome it being capped, so that you are not, so that students, rest of UK students are not spending more on their education. Now Strathclyde is capped. I thought I had the figure in front of me. I think it's around about 27,000, so it comes out the same as 6,000 or so a year, which is great. Fortunately for us, we're in a quite a nice position where you're not talking in the millions as it stands. So we're in a wee little bit a better position with it. That it's not going to break the bank, if that makes sense. But yeah, we welcome a cap at it across the country, because we think that it shouldn't cost more than what it's costing south of the border.
Yeah, well, we at UWS we come at this from an interesting point of view that we've got about 200 rest of the UK students, so very, very small. So again, just to echo Malcolm's views, we would support a cap. We would support a cap that means that it's not any more expensive to come and study than it is to maybe study down south. We'd also look at ways in terms of there needs to be some sort of support package, bursary package. If the core message of this bill was to widen access, then we can't make sure that includes the rest of the UK students, and so you don't get only the most wealthy coming up to Scotland to study. So again, a portion of the fees brought in has to be ring-fenced for bursary support packages as well. Something I would like to add, and because we've only got about 200 rest of the UK students, 200 rest of the UK students studying at UWS, then the amount of funding money that we could get under this system is limited in comparison to maybe an institution like Edinburgh, who has a high number of rest of the UK students. So one thing that we would ask is that we monitor this system to make sure that the amount of cash that Edinburgh can generate isn't so much greater in comparison to UWS.
I would echo what everyone's already said. I think there should be a fee cap for the amount that the rest of the UK students can be charged. But I noticed that it said a fee cap within each academic year. And I think it's important to consider what is that when they come to Scottish institutions, what they're going to get from it. Because as far as I'm aware, most students will do an honours when they come and do a bachelor, and I think that needs to be taken into consideration because it means they're paying for that additional year. And whether or not something needs to be considered where a fee is charged for the award that they're going to receive when they complete their course.
I'd also just like to say, and I hope I'm not speaking for everyone here, but we have a stance of no fees, and in an ideal world there would be no fees for education. It would be free for everyone, and that would be the real solution, and for widening access. No fees for any students, and that's the stance of Strathclyde at least, and I would hope of all students' associations across Scotland and the UK. I would hope.
The UK students as well, no fees.
I mean, it's like that across the EU anyway, so.
I would go far as say it would be free education across the world would be what students' associations would be looking for.
I think we'll still stick to trying to control the situation.
Right. Okay.
Well, today's Scotland, tomorrow the world. But, just we'll stick with that.
Have to start somewhere.
Indeed. Neil, you finished?
Yeah,
okay. Can I move on to Claire Adamson, please, on the review of fundable further and higher education bodies, please?
Yeah, I know you were all here to hear the question earlier about the Scottish Funding Council doing a review of higher and further education with a view to ensuring that education is provided in a coherent manner across the sectors. And I was just wondering if you had a position about the premises on which this is based and how you see that moving forward.
I think there's two ways you can look at it. First of all, it places a lot of power in the hands of the Scottish Minister. The way we would support it is if it could stop universities. Sorry, we would support it as if it could stop a situation like Strathclyde a few years ago where courses were removed. where we would be less likely to support it would be if Abertay University issue rose again, where it was said that institutions were being forced without the consent of the two institutions.
And is there anyone else to put on that one?
I think at the moment, I completely agree with what Gary said. I think it makes sense to have a review of higher education. And I know it says a review of higher education and further education, and I think that's important because it's education as a whole, or that's how I see it. And I know that some people will say that, well, potentially what's going to happen is certain courses at different institutions are going to get cut because, you know, there's too many people applying to that course and we don't need it. But the other opposite can be said, because it's about protecting the courses that we do need at the moment. So, for instance, if we suddenly need more nurses, then more places can be put for those that want to go on a nursing course or modern language teaching, etc.
The previous panel definitely talked about what was a student-led demand system to what they're actually doing at the moment. Do you all feel that is the situation at the moment?
Sorry. When it was mentioned before that there would be a change from, at the moment, it's meeting the demands of potential students, and then what's possibly going to happen is there's just going to be all these places and we just hope that students take them. I don't think that would happen. I would hope and presume that it would always come down to demand and what it is that people need, but also what is that we need as a country.
Presumably you agree that it can't just be demand-led. You know, we can't all get what we all want. You know, as you indicated there, clearly there are demands from industry and business for students and graduates in certain sectors, and it's a limited pot of money, and etc. etc. There are reasons why we can't have a completely demand-led system. So I presume you accept that it's a balancing act.
Yeah, it's a balance between everything.
Yeah. Okay.
So I guess the review is, you know, we welcome Section 14, but from our perspective, we've got to be cautious in the sense that it could go, you know, it could protect, you know, courses and local provision, but it could also cut them. So we're cautious on that, and also the cost.
In that case, what's your response to the comment within putting learners at the centre, where it said, and I'll quote directly from the document, it says, "There's too much duplication and unnecessary competition within regional universities." That would tend to suggest that effectively something has to be done about that. There has to be some sort of intervention.
I mean, I think the only point that I would make is that there still has to be the local context of that. The fact that, I mean, at UWS we have sometimes the same courses in Hamilton and at Paisley, and the distance is very small. But to get one of the features to widen access is you have to use the phrase, have a university college on your doorstep, and I suppose that helps it to a certain aspect.
Anybody else want to comment on that quote I've just read from Putting Learners at the Centre?
I personally am a strong believer of sort of free market and competition. This is my personal opinion here, and I think that if you have, you know, a number of institutions providing the same form of course, then they will strive to perform, you know, to be the best and to deliver the best education that they possibly can, which I believe is a good thing.
Okay, thank you. Can I move on now to Colin Beattie on the regionalisation and its impact on universities?
I think all the panel was here when the universities gave their opinion on this previously. Perhaps you could just comment on the, you know, from your perspective, the positive and negative impact of college regionalisation in relation to Scottish universities engaging with these colleges, and whether there's any sign of sharing resources and so on from your perspective.
Question, sorry.
Sure. Maybe I'll break it down. What are the implications from your perspective, positive and negative, for the universities engaging proactively with the colleges in terms of the regionalisation?
I think that we'd be looking for any discussion around the college regionalisation is the fact that we've got a high number of college students who come straight to UWS, and we want that protected. and we would also be looking for the articulated routes that I mentioned earlier to be sustained and to possibly used elsewhere, so college students can possibly articulate into Strathclyde or Edinburgh as well. So they're the two key features that we'd be looking at under this programme.
I think also if with regionalisation, there's potential for students' associations to be more effective within the colleges. I was reading through, I think it was either last night or this morning, I was reading through the explanation notes, and I think having members on the boards from students' associations is a great thing, and it would help us to work with those students' associations. It's not just necessarily the institutions that need to engage with the regionalised colleges, and the actual students' associations should be able to work better together, I think.
From our own experience, it's been an institution that merged a few years ago. One of the lessons that we learned as students was during that process, you do need time, and we say the student views during that process have to be listened to. There was cases during the whole process of merging that previous VAC officers didn't feel that the views were taken on board, so we'd look at students being involved in that merger process as well.
Yeah, I think when it comes to institutions working together, I know that from the University of Stirling, they're doing a lot more to work with Forth Valley College. A new thing that was introduced last year was they've now got a degree that's provided by the University of Stirling, but 3 years of it is done at Forth Valley campus, and then the last year they come into the University of Stirling campus. And I think it's really good and really positive that they're looking into that even more in different ways they can do. Different things that they can do, but I think Malcolm made a great point where it's not just about institutions working together, but it's about students' unions and students' associations to make sure that students are getting everything they need.
I don't know enough about this to be able to add anything.
From what the university principals were saying, there's already a fair degree, as I think yourselves were stating, of exchange between colleges and universities. Would you see an opportunity for more sharing of resources with the regionalised colleges than perhaps it is at the moment?
I think on the point you've just mentioned about student associations, just that seems to me to be quite an obvious and helpful link, because I think it's really the students who, well, the students make it. Yeah. That to me jumps out as being making sense.
Yeah, so we've got a large amount of students, UWS students, who study in the college and vice versa. So if this regionalisation agenda fits that purpose, then it would be something that would be welcomed.
Strathclyde are working quite closely with some colleges on articulation in regards to sharing resources. I wouldn't be able to speak for the university. I imagine it wouldn't be something that's welcomed. However, the cuts that are ongoing at the moment in colleges won't be helping with the resources, and I don't think universities will be able to make up for the, I believe it's 36 million.
Just one point on that point.
I wasn't actually suggesting the universities would be subsidising the colleges.
If there's shared resources, then you need to make sure that these students are maybe studying in the college or vice versa aren't forgotten about because they're not on the main campus. Too often we hear that the UWS students on City of College feel that they're not represented or they're not given the same level of support as possibly a student who's studying in the main campus Paisley.
Thank you. Claire Adamson, quick question.
It was just a quick comparison to what you said about the integration and the working together between the colleges and universities. If I take that in the context of what you said about widening access and that it's there and the work's been done, but it's not happening quick enough. Although there is this work going on, do you think that the pace of change and the pace of integration is quick enough?
No.
I think it seems to be an indifference in terms of the relationship between various universities and colleges, for example. It seems to be much more easier for a student coming from a college to articulate into advanced entry to UWS than it is at possibly Edinburgh. So again, make the point that every university has to do their part in terms of widening access, but also when it comes to articulation.
Sorry, are you going to mention something? And just to add as well, I think the question of contextualised admissions comes into this as well, and recognising different entries into university. I think that's one of the big issues, because ultimately there's only so many Scots EU that any one university can take, and it's easy for the university to say, well, we'll take the 5As, or of which there are a hugely disproportionately lower number in the lower SIMD numbers, if you're going to use that measurement. So I think in order for that to work, I think that there needs to be more assistance pressure, however you want to do it, onto the universities to really, when I've talked about it at my university, it's kind of, oh, well, sometimes maybe this, that, and the other. And I just think that in order to recognise potential, there needs to be some formal coercion into that. And again, sharing best practice across universities would probably be useful. Where interviews have or haven't worked in certain situations, for example.
If contextualised admissions are the same across the board, then there's no longer an issue with it. If everyone's doing the same. And what Freddie was saying there is that, there's only so many people. If Strathclyde are looking to increase the percentage of students from SIMD 20 or SIMD 40 backgrounds, we're looking to do that, and there's only so many. We're not doing any. If we don't increase our outreach, then there's only so many potential students, and then we might find that we're actually taking some away from Cali. Now, if we can actually increase the outreach, increase the number of people that are interested in education, that want to apply and that have the ability to do so and potential, then through contextualised admissions, if it's standardised across the board, then it would be a fantastic thing for Scottish education.
Can I just one final question, because we're pretty much out of time. Can I just ask for a very short answer on this from each of you? What are your hopes and expectations for this bill? What do you hope will come out of it in terms of benefits for students at universities? I'll start with you, Malcolm, and work along.
Yeah, I guess for me, the widening access is the main one. So to be able to sit down in university meetings and say, this is being legislated, you need to work on it, and you will need to work with us. We have these additional places, and what are we going to do, and how is it going to happen? We can speak about why for so long, but until we actually have some form of leverage that we can say, how are we doing this? And that's the main thing.
Okay.
Thank you, Gerry. I think that same hope in terms of widening access, but I think you still need to bear in mind that widening access isn't about getting students into university, it's about retaining them and allowing them to graduate in the end. I still think we need to be more aware of the reasons why students drop out, but we need to be more prepared of the potential pitfalls that could arise from this. Therefore, hopefully, institutions, the Scottish Government, the Scottish Parliament, student associations start to have discussions about what they can do more to retain students of all backgrounds.
Thank you. Christina?
When it comes to, I'm just going to take sections of it as we went along. When it comes to the good governance and review, I think it's about having transparency in institutions, and I think that will come from the bill. And I think when it comes to widening access, it's about all universities working together to improve the intake, and not only encouraging students in, but also supporting them when they get there. And I think this would hopefully encourage that.
Thank you. Freddie?
As I mentioned earlier, my main concern in all of this is to make sure that there is an understanding of the different challenges faced by different universities. Now, I'm reflecting obviously my own experience here, but I have to resist what Neil Findlay said earlier, that I was recycling old arguments. I mean, whether it's about St Andrews not having the kind of local population that you find in somewhere like Glasgow, or that's one instance of a particular local problem. There are different local problems at different universities, and I think what I'd really hope for is an understanding that we're not enemies here. We're not, I hope that the student associations, the universities, and the Parliament can work together and actually analyse what the problems are and come up with a sophisticated and mature solution, rather than viewing it as a kind of, this has to be some sort of battle. This has to be somehow confrontational, and it's kind of, one versus the other. I think the problems are much more complicated than some of the. And I mentioned ambiguity earlier in the bill. I think it's kind of, what can we do that kind of, a one solution that looks good? Well, every institution is different, and I think the sooner that Parliament appreciates that different solutions in different contexts will work, the better.
Thank you very much. Can I thank all of you for coming this morning? And just before I close the meeting, can I just give apologies from Liam MacArthur, who was delayed by transport difficulties. I had hoped to be here, but obviously has unfortunately failed to manage that, and he has sent in his apologies by email. And I now close the meeting to the public.